The lake lay quiet under low light, the sort of quiet that made a child speak softer without knowing why. It was near the summer solstice, when the days ran long and the evenings seemed to refuse to end, when light clung stubbornly to hedges and stone walls, and the sky refused to turn fully dark until long after sensible folk had shut their doors. Yet the light at the water's edge had a different feel to it. It lingered, but it didn't warm. It rested on the surface of the lake like something careful, like something that didn't want to disturb what lay beneath. The cottages were back up the track, small squares of amber in their windows, doors left ajar to let in air, voices drifting faint in the warm stretch of evening. Someone laughed, someone called a child's name. The smell of cooking drifted faintly from one chimney, then was swallowed by damp. Down here, the lake kept its own counsel. Rosie Concannon walked with her dog, Dilleen, close to her lake. She kept him close because her mother had said so, because the reeds were thick in places and the mud could take a boot clean off if you weren't paying attention. Rosie was small, 7 years of age, with a coat that had belonged to someone else first. The fabric had a history to it. The cuffs were worn shiny, the lining had been patched at the elbows, the sleeves were pushed up and still fell past her wrists, swallowing her hands unless she shook them free. Her boots had dried muck cracked in the seams from older walks, mud that had worked its way into the stitching and dried their impale lines. One lace had been tied in a knot so thick it looked like it would never come undone, the kind of knot a child made when she'd given up trying to do it properly. She held Dilleen's lead in both hands the way a child held something important, even if it was only a bit of rope tied to a collar. She didn't wrap it around her wrist. She didn't let it trail. She gripped it as if she'd been told this was her responsibility and she meant to do it right. Dilleen was a quick little thing, ears up, nose down, pulling toward every smell as if the whole world had been left there for him to read. His paws moved in short bursts, his tail flicking as he caught one scent, then another. He tugged toward the reeds, then toward a patch of flattened grass, then back again, impatient with the slowness of the human attached to him. "Easy," Rosie murmured, not sharp, just steady. "Easy now, Dilleen." Her voice carried no command in it. It was the sound of a girl repeating something she had heard said to her. The reeds at the edge of the lake sighed against one another. The sound was soft and dry, a brushing noise that seemed to travel along the bank. The ground was damp underfoot, black earth that kept the print in every step. If Rosie had looked back, she would have seen her boots stamped clearly in the mud, heel and toe defined, Dilleen's smaller paw prints darting around hers. The soil held memory. It didn't forget easily. Rosie could smell the lake mud, that thick, sour smell that clung to wet weeds and old water and stones that never properly dried. It wasn't pleasant, but it was familiar. It was the smell of this place. It clung to her coat hem when she walked too close. It settled into the seams of her boots. Dilleen stopped. It was abrupt enough that Rosie nearly walked into him. His head lifted. His nose stopped moving. His tail went rigid. Rosie felt the change through the rope before she understood it. The tension shifted. The tug became a brace. She looked down at him. He didn't bark or whine. He didn't scratch the ground or strain to get closer. He simply stood there, staring at the water, as if it had shifted shape in front of him. "What is it, Dilleen?" Rosie said. She leaned forward slightly, peering over his head, as if she might see what he saw if she matched the angle. Dilleen took one step forward and stopped again. Rosie followed his gaze. At first, she saw a pale patch by the reeds and thought it was a sack or a torn sheet someone had dumped. The lake had a way of carrying things to its edges and leaving them there as if it had decided it no longer needed them. The pail caught her eye because everything else along the bank was dark, mud, reeds, water with a dull sheen. The patch looked off against the colours around it. It was the colour of it that fooled her. The lake had a way of bleaching things in the shallows, turning even wood and cloth into something ghost pale. Dillian made a small sound in his chest, not quite a growl, more like a warning that wanted permission to become louder. Rosie's hand tightened on the rope. She didn't realize she was gripping harder until the fibers pressed into her skin. She didn't mean to move closer, but she did, because children did that when something didn't make sense. They stepped nearer, trying to make their eyes fix the world into something ordinary. They trusted that if they got close enough, the strange thing would reveal itself as harmless. The pale patch was a woman. The truth of it didn't arrive all at once. It assembled itself in pieces. First the fabric of the dress, heavy and dark where it met water, and then the hair, long and spread in wet strings across the mud. Then the shape of the body lying twisted at the edge where water met earth. One arm was bent under her in a way that made Rosie's stomach feel hollow, as if the bones had stopped doing what bones were meant to do. The angle was wrong. It didn't belong to someone resting. The woman's face was turned partly toward the bank. Her skin had the pallor of a body pulled from water, but there was more to it than that. There was a dryness around the hands and cheeks, as if the lake had not only drowned her, but drained her. The fingers looked too thin, stretched. The skin looked drawn tight over the knuckles, the way Rosie had seen on very old people who sat by the fire and never moved much, their hands resting in their laps like folded sticks. Rosie didn't have words for what her eyes were telling her, but her mind tried to fit it into something it already knew. Old. Almost too old. The dress was soaked at the hem, heavy with lake muck that clung and wouldn't shake free. One shoe was still on, the leather split along the seam as if it had been worn far too long. The other foot lay bare, toes half buried in wet earth, the nails dulled with mud. Rosie stood still. Dillian pulled, wanting to go back, and Rosie let him pull, but her legs didn't move. Her feet felt planted in the mud like stakes driven down to hold something in place. She heard a small ripple in the reeds. It was soft, almost polite. She looked down. The lake water crept forward and kissed the bank in a thin sheet, just enough to wet the toe of her boot. Rosie jerked her foot back as if the water had bitten her. Her breath came fast and shallow. She could hear it in her ears. She could feel it rushing through her. She couldn't make herself look away from the woman's face. The eyes were shut. The mouth was half open. The lips looked cracked. There was a moment, a child's moment, where she waited for the woman to breathe. The woman didn't move. Dillian let out a sharp bark, high and urgent, and that sound broke the spell of standing still. Rosie turned and ran. She didn't run in a straight line. She ran in the way children ran when fear made them clumsy. Her boots slipped in the damp, and she flung her arms out to keep herself upright, nearly dropping the rope. Dillian pulled hard, nearly taking her off her feet, and Rosie let him drag her because she couldn't bear to be the one leading anymore. She ran through the reeds that snagged her coat and slapped her legs. The rope burned her palms where she held it too tight. The sound of her boots sucking at the mud followed her for a few steps before the ground grew firmer. Her heart pounded hard enough that she could feel it in her ears, a heavy thud that matched the rhythm of her steps. She didn't put a name on it. She just ran. She ran until the bank fell behind her and the lake smell thinned and the first cottage path appeared, packed earth instead of mud. She ran until she could see lamplight through a window, warm and steady and ordinary, and only then did she shout. Only then did she scream for someone, anyone, because she was Rosie Concannon, and she was small, and she had seen a dead woman by the reeds, and the lake had touched her boot as if it had noticed her. Tiernan Keane sat in his rented room above a shop that sold nothing anyone needed after dark. You got to it by going down an alley that always smelled of damp stone and old rubbish, past a back door with peeling paint, and up a narrow staircase that creaked even if you took it slow. The boards had been nailed more than once. The wall along the stairs had a faint mark where shoulders brushed it over the years. The room itself was small enough that a tall man had to mind his elbows. One bed, narrow and made tight. One chair with a split in the backrest. One table, scarred by use. A small hearth that gave more smoke than heat, unless you coaxed it with care and practice. Tiernan kept it neat, but not comfortable. His coat hung from a peg, his boots were placed side by the wall, cleaned of the worst of the mud, the soles scraped with the edge of a knife. A basin sat on a small stand with water in it, and a folded towel, as if he had done it without thinking, muscle memory rather than fuss. On the table were objects laid out like a man was preparing for work. Not prayer, twine, a small iron nail, a pocket knife with a handle worn smooth by years of use, a cloth bundle tied in a tight knot, a thin book with a cracked spine that could have been scripture from a distance until you came closer and saw the penciled notes in the margins, the small adjustments, the underlined lines. Tiernan didn't waste movement. He didn't fidget. He didn't tap. He didn't pace. He sat with his shoulders relaxed but ready, like a man waiting for a knock that always came sooner than he wanted it to. His hands rested on the table, not clenched, just idle. His face was controlled, the kind of control that didn't look calm so much as decided. People called it cold. People called it rude. Tiernan didn't care what people called it because people only ever came looking for him when their own names didn't protect them anymore. He reached for the cloth bundle. He untied it carefully, not delicate, just precise. Inside were pieces of hawthorn. Not one twig, but several fragments broken into sections and wrapped separately in thin strips of cloth. They were small enough to fit in the palm, but the sight of them made the room feel a fraction tighter, as if they carried a weight that didn't belong to wood. Tiernan lifted one piece and examined the split. He had already tried to mend it in his own way, fine thread, darker than ordinary twine, wound around the break with the patience of someone stitching skin. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't meant to hold. He stared at the fragments for a long moment, and something in his eyes hardened, as if the break offended him. He rewrapped the pieces and tied the bundle again. He stood, took his coat from the peg, and slid it on. He moved like he had done the same route 1,000 times, and would do it 1,000 more whether he wanted to or not. Outside, the alley held onto the day's warmth in pockets, but the air still carried that lake country damp. It clung to stone, it clung to timber, it clung to a man's sleeves if he brushed a wall. Tiernan led his horse out from the small yard where a boy slept in a cart under a blanket, paid to mind it. The boy shifted onto the fabric but didn't wake. The horse was with Tiernan for many years. It didn't shy or fuss. It simply stood as Tiernan checked the tack and tightened the strap with quick, practiced hands. Tiernan swung into the saddle. He didn't head for the village. He headed for the oldest hawthorn in the county. People had a name for it that older men said under their breath and younger men pretended not to hear. Sceach Shiorai, the Everthorn. It stood where the land rose slightly beyond a patchwork of fields, not quite a hill, but a place where the wind had more say. The trunk was thick, twisted, old enough to have its own shape that didn't answer to anything else. The bark was rough and split in places, rigid by years. The branches spread wide, and even in summer there was something about it that made birds keep their distance. Tiernan slowed as he approached. He didn't take his hat off. He didn't make a show of respect. He simply moved the way you moved around something that could ruin you if you treated it like nothing. He dismounted and tied the horse off at the post that had been there so long it looked like it had grown out of the ground. Tiernan knelt near the roots where they pushed up through the soil like knotted fingers, and he took out his pocket knife and worked a shallow hollow into the earth beside one of the larger roots. The soil was dark and damp. It gave easily, as if it had been turned here before. And from his pocket he pulled out a small folded paper packet and opened it. Inside was a dark grit, fine as pepper. It clung to the paper and to the skin of his thumb. Vessel dust. Tiernan didn't say the words out loud. He didn't need to. It was scrapings taken from objects that had once held other things. Old presents, old residue, something that remained when the obvious had gone. He tipped it into the hollow, then used the flat of his knife to mix it into the soil. He folded the earth over it like a man kneading something stubborn. He worked slowly, ensuring it spread evenly, practical, grim, no flourish. Then he took out the hawthorn bundle. He untied it and laid the pieces in his palm. He chose the largest fragment first, the one with the thread already binding the split. He held it there for a moment, as if weighing whether it deserved to be used again. Then he set it into the soil, repaired section down, pressed close to the root. He added the other fragments around it, fitting them in as neatly as a man could fit broken wood into a wound of earth. Tiernan pressed the soil back over the pieces, packing it down with the heel of his hand. He evened the top with a short, firm motion, shaping it the way he wanted it to sit, flat enough to hide and marked enough that he would know if anyone had meddled. He leaned closer, voice low, and whispered to the soil in Irish. "Fós agus fan," he murmured. "Fós agus fan lum." Grow and stay with me. It wasn't a prayer, it was instruction, the same way you spoke to a gate that wouldn't shut or an animal that wouldn't settle. Tiernan sat back on his heels, looking at the spot, and you could have mistaken it for a man finishing a chore. That was the truth of it. He was maintaining a tool. He was keeping something alive because he had use for it, because he didn't trust himself to be without it. He stood, wiped his hand on his trouser leg, and looked up at Sceach Shiorai. His expression didn't soften. If he felt anything, it stayed locked away where it always stayed. He turned, untied his horse, and mounted again. He rode back to his regular place with the same measured pace. By the time he reached the alley, there was a man waiting below the stairs. Dano Gill wasn't from here, not from Tiernan's street, not from Tiernan's life. You could tell by the way he stood, as if the alley itself might grab him. His cap was pulled down, his shoulders hunched, hands rough and red. He looked like he'd been awake too long, watching the light fade, as if it might not come back. Mr. Keane." Tiernan didn't give him a greeting. He stepped closer, just enough to make Dano feel the difference between standing alone and standing in front of someone who didn't care about manners. Dano cleared his throat. My name's Dano Gill." Tiernan's eyes passed over him once, quick and sharp. Dano gestured with his head toward the direction of the next village. There's trouble." Tiernan's voice was flat. "There's always trouble." Dano's jaw tightened. "A body was found, Mr. Keane." Tiernan held Dano's gaze. "When?" "A few nights ago," Dano said. Tiernan's face didn't change. "Where exactly was this?" "Down by the lake," Dano replied. "At the reed edge, close enough to the bank that a child came upon her." Tiernan's eyes narrowed a fraction. "A child? And who was this child?" "Rosie Concannon," Dano said. She's about 6 or 7. She was out with her dog, and she ran back near out of her mind." Tiernan nodded, as if filing the name away in a place he could reach later. "And who saw the body after that?" "2 men," Dano said. "They went down with a lantern. They wouldn't listen to anyone telling them to wait." Tiernan's voice stayed level. "And was anything taken?" Dano blinked. "Taken? A ring, brooch, shoes, a purse, anything stupid?" Dano swallowed. "Not that I know of." Tiernan looked at him until Dano felt his own answer being weighed, and Dano added quickly, "No one is saying there's a robbery, Mr. Keane. They're saying it looked unnatural." Tiernan didn't react to the word. He didn't seize it or ask Dano to explain it like a priest asking for confession. He simply waited. Dano dragged a hand over his mouth. Locals won't handle it. They won't bring her in proper. A priest's rattled. Men are talking about keeping their daughters indoors. A few are saying there's been a pattern. Folks near the lake losing time. Strange finds. Dogs refusing to go down there. You know how talk grows. Tiernan's answer came dry. Talk grows even when nothing does. Dano leaned forward, urgency in him. This isn't nothing. Tiernan didn't look impressed. If anything, he looked annoyed to be disturbed. And what do you want from me? Tiernan asked. Dano hesitated because admitting it out loud made it more real. They said, you're the man, Dano said. They said you've done jobs other men won't touch, that you see what's there without needing it explained. Tiernan stepped past him toward the stairs. Dano followed, half a step behind, like a man trailing after a doctor. Tiernan stopped at the bottom step and turned. The pay is later, he said. I'll come down and have a look. If it's what you think it is, you'll pay like it is. Dano nodded too quickly. Yes, of course, anything. Tiernan watched him. And where are you based? In the village east of Letterfrack, Dano said. I have rooms there. People know me. I can get you in and out without half the county staring. Tiernan gave the smallest nod. Dano tried again to push. We should probably go now. There's men saying they'll go down there with ropes and drag her out and give her a look over themselves. Tiernan cut across him, quiet but final. I'm not walking into anything blind. Dano frowned, confusion and desperation mixing. What do you mean? Tiernan's eyes held his. I need to check someone first. Dano shifted his weight. Who? Tiernan didn't answer the name. Instead he stepped down off the stair, walked to the edge of the alley and turned into the narrow gap between the two buildings where rubbish was thrown when people couldn't be bothered carrying it further. Dano followed despite himself. The smell hit first, rotting food, wet cloth, old ash and sour waste. Flies weren't thick because it wasn't full summer, but there was enough warm damp in the stone to keep a stink alive. Tiernan crouched and began moving things aside with his boot. He did it methodically. A broken crate, a sack with something soft and rotten in it, a tin that cut his knuckles when he shifted it. He didn't curse, he didn't flinch, he simply kept going. Dano stood over him, baffled. Tiernan reached under a heap of torn cloth and pulled something out by the hind leg. A dead cat. It was stiff, eyes cloudy, fur matted with filth. Its ribs showed, and its mouth hung slightly open, as if it had died mid-breath. Dano recoiled a step. Mr. Keane, what in God's name are you doing? Tiernan rose with the cat hanging from his hand. His voice stayed calm. It's business you wouldn't understand. Dano stared at him, pale in the alley gloom. That's Mr. Keane, that's... Tiernan looked at him, and Dano shut up. Tiernan stepped back out of the gap, wiped his hand on a ragged sack, and started walking again, the cat swinging slightly with each step. Dano hurried after him. Mr. Keane, we can't be bringing that through the village. Tiernan didn't slow. We won't be bringing this anywhere. Dano blinked. What? What do you mean? Tiernan stopped and turned. You'll go on ahead, meet me in the village. Tell no one I left your side. Tell them I had to secure my horse. Tell them what you like. Dano's brows pinched. And you're going to have to see someone first. Who? That's none of your business, Mr. Gill. That's none of your business. Now go. It wasn't an argument. It was a decision. Dano looked down the road, then back at Tiernan, and whatever he saw on Tiernan's face made him accept it. Fair enough, Dano said quietly. I'll meet you down there. Tiernan gave a brief nod, and Dano left at a brisk walk that turned into a jog once he was out of the alley. Tiernan waited until Dano was gone. Only then did he ride out of the village, taking the darker route where hedges grew thick and paths stopped being friendly. He reached a patch of ground that looked empty to anyone else, a dip in the land, briar, a stone half sunk into the earth, a place you would pass without seeing. Tiernan stopped and held the dead cat out at arm's length. "Shamey," he said. Silence. Tiernan didn't repeat himself right away. He waited. The briar shifted slightly, as if something small had moved behind it. A voice came out, sharp with amusement.
"Oh, you've got some neck, Keane."
Shamey stepped into view like he'd been standing there the whole time, listening. He was small, but there was nothing gentle about him. His clothes looked like old tweed cut down to fit, knees scuffed, cuffs frayed. His face was lined like a hard-lived man's face, and his eyes were bright with a mean sort of humour. He looked at the dead cat and clicked his tongue.
"That's your payment, is it?" Shamey said. "You're trying to buy me off with a stiff cat, boy."
Tiernan's answer was plain. "It's payment, Shamey, come on." Shamey took it by the tail with 2 fingers like he didn't want filth on him, lifted it, inspected it, and made a face.
"Could have at least warmed it by the fire. It's colder than a witch's tit."
Tiernan didn't smile. Shamey looked up at him again.
"So, what is it this time?"
Tiernan said, "The lake down by Letterfrack." Shamey's expression changed by a fraction. The grin didn't vanish, it tightened.
"That,"
Shamey said, voice dry,
"that is outside my jurisdiction."
Tiernan held his gaze. "It's in mine." Shamey gave a short laugh.
"Oh, you always say that, like you can draw a line with your boot and tell the dark to mind its manners."
Tiernan didn't rise to it. "A child found a woman dead by the reeds." Shamey's eyes narrowed.
"A woman?"
Tiernan nodded. Shamey bounced the cat slightly in his hand.
"Centuries,"
Shamey said, and there was a tiredness under the humour for a heartbeat.
"Centuries of folk going missing near water and swearing they were only going for a look. More missing than found, more found than named."
Tiernan watched him. "Do you know what it is?" Shamey's mouth curled.
"I know enough to say your village has a talent for stepping where it shouldn't."
Tiernan spoke quietly. "Well, I'm going down either way." Shamey snorted.
"Of course you are."
Tiernan added. "I only came to make sure I wasn't walking in blind." Shamey leaned closer, eyes bright.
"And you think I'm your lantern, do you?"
Tiernan didn't deny it. "You see things men don't." Shamey's grin widened.
"Aye, and I also be thinking you're the only man with a spine. Right so, back in a sec."
"What?" Tiernan asked. Shamey lifted the cat again.
"Can't be letting you have all the fun. I'm coming along with you."
Tiernan's eyes sharpened. "Absolutely not." Shamey's grin turned crude.
"Absolutely yes. You'll only go make a holy mess of it on your own."
Tiernan's voice stayed flat. "Shamey, it's not a game." Shamey's eyes held his.
"No, it's an adventure."
Tiernan sighed and said, "You'll stay out of sight when there's people near." Shamey waved a hand dismissively.
"I've been hiding from people since before your grandparents were bad ideas."
Tiernan turned to leave. Shamey followed, cat swinging from his hand, and Tiernan heard a small hoof sound behind him and glanced back despite himself. Shamey was climbing onto a small Shetland pony that had been standing half hidden behind the briar, patient as if it had carried worse men than Shamey and never complained. Tiernan's mouth tightened with irritation. "Where'd you get that?" Shamey patted the pony's neck.
"Borrowed."
Tiernan's eyes narrowed. "Borrowed from who?" Shamey grinned.
"Some blind drunk lad who has no business owning a pony in the first place."
Tiernan shook his head, a brief motion that held more annoyance than any lecture. Shamey leaned forward on the pony like a king on a throne that was too small.
"Right so," Shamey said, "and we're off."
Tiernan shook his head, regretting this arrangement already. Shamey clicked his tongue, and the pony stepped forward. Tiernan started for the road, and Shamey fell in behind him, as if he had invited himself into Tiernan's work, and Tiernan had no power to stop it. Back toward the village, Dan O'Gill would be waiting, thinking Tiernan was his answer. Tiernan kept his eyes ahead. The lake was waiting, too. The road out of the last town was still grey with early light, but it had that bright edge to it that came in June. The air clean, the hedges thick, the sky already making promises it hadn't earned. The stones under hoof had held the night's damp. In places the surface looked dry, but every so often a horse's shoe found a darker patch and the sound changed, softer, as if the road itself had a thick skin over it. A cart track ran alongside for a while, rutted and old, the grass pushed flat where heels had cut through for years. Beyond it, fields sat behind low walls, sheep already moving in clumps, heads down. Farther out again, the land rolled toward darker hills, and the light kept catching in the wet leaves as if someone had rubbed oil into them. Tiernan rode with his shoulders set, coat collar turned up, more out of habit than chill. The air had a mildness to it, but there was still that lake country damp that clung to stone and lingered in the seams of a man's clothes. Tiernan let it sit there and didn't give it a thought. His horse moved beneath him with the steady patience of an animal that had learned his rider's mood and didn't waste its own. The horse kept a straight line in the road without being asked twice. When Tiernan loosened the reins even slightly, his horse didn't take it as permission to wander. He just held the pace. There was a calm in it. That wasn't softness. It was the calm of a thing that could do damage and didn't need to prove it. Behind him and slightly to the side, Shamey came along on a pony that looked as if it had been bred for stubbornness and spite. Its shaggy mane stood up in tufts like it had lost a fight with a hedge. Its tail flicked at nothing. Its hooves landed like it was doing the road a favour, each step loud enough to make sure everybody knew it had turned up. Shamey was singing, if it could be called that. It was loud and it was off-key, and it had the self-satisfied air of a man who had never been corrected in his life. He had a habit of dragging words out when it suited him, then chewing through a line too fast when the rhythm escaped him. He didn't mind the rhythm escaping. He sang as if the sound alone was proof he was winning.
Oh, I took me heart to the river, and I left me boots in the bog, and I kissed a girl in the doorway, and I woke up next to the dog.
"Shamey," Tiernan said at last, "do you want to go back?"
No,
Shamey said, without missing a beat. He didn't even pause to consider it. He sang the answer more than spoke it, like the word no was part of his tune. "Then put a sock in it like a good lad," Tiernan replied. Shamey's laugh burst out, delighted and shameless. He slapped a hand down on his pony's neck as if the pony had told the joke. The pony flicked an ear and kept walking, unimpressed.
"A sock," Shamey said. "If I had a sock to spare, I'd have tied it around me arse this morning."
Tiernan's eyes stayed forward. His face stayed level, but the muscles in his jaw moved once, the smallest sign of a man putting a thought away rather than letting it out. Shamey shifted in his saddle with a sour look.
"I forgot me ointment, and I forgot it clean, and you know what that means."
Tiernan gave him nothing, not even a grunt. He held his horse steady and let Shamey talk himself out.
"It means I'd be walking like a man with a rake shoved up him by midday," Shamey announced. "And you'll be sitting up there on your fine beast as if you owned the county."
Tiernan's horse continued, untroubled. His ears angled forward and back in a slow pattern, reading the road, reading Tiernan, reading the sound behind. It didn't flinch at Shamey's voice. It had heard worse. Shamey kept riding as if he had a point to prove to nobody. He scratched at the side of his leg, then lifted his weight again as if trying to find the one position that didn't rub. He glanced down at his pony with contempt, like the pony was personally responsible for his discomfort.
Don't look at me like that," Shamey muttered at the animal. "You're only a pony, and you've never known the dignity of a proper saddle."
The pony snorted, a small, dry sound, and kept walking. Shamey's eyes travelled over Tiernan's horse, taking in the shoulders, the neck, the quiet strength of it. He watched the way the horse placed each hoof like the robe belonged to him. He watched the way the horse's skin shifted under the coat with every movement, the muscle working smooth and easy. Shamey made a small sound of appreciation, the kind men made when looking at a well-built tool, and then he asked the question.
Oh, that's a fine nag you've got there yourself, Shamey said. What's he called?
Tiernan's horse stopped, dead. Not a stumble, not a hesitation. Stopped. The sudden lack of movement ran up through Tiernan's legs and into his hands. The reins went taut without Tiernan yanking them. It was the horse making a choice. The road ahead was clear, the hedges weren't crowding, there was no cart coming, there was no reason for it, except the question. Tiernan's hand tightened on the reins just enough to hold the paws in place. He let out a slow breath that came from pure familiarity. This had happened before, and it would happen again, and it was always at the least convenient time. He didn't turn around. He didn't look back at Shamey. He kept his eyes forward, as if staring hard enough would make the moment disappear. He sighed, eyes forward, and muttered under his breath. You had to bring that up. His horse turned his head slightly, just enough to look back, as if waiting. Tiernan's jaw moved once. He held the moment for a heartbeat longer, as if hoping the horse would take pity on him, and then he conceded. The horse's name is Lasir, he said. The word came out plain, with no warmth and no theatre. It was a man saying the name of a tool. It was also a man conceding to a habit he'd never managed to break in the animal beneath him. Lasir resumed walking at once, satisfied. Shamey blinked, none the wiser. He looked pleased with himself, like he'd been paid for asking.
Grand name, he said. Sounds fierce, like you'd take a bite out of a priest if he got half the chance.
Tiernan didn't correct him. He didn't reward it with a glance. They rode on in the brightening morning, the road narrowing and widening with the land. At one point the track dipped and the air changed, cooler where the trees leaned in and the sunlight didn't get a clean line through. The smell shifted too, crushed leaves, damp bark, the old smell of water somewhere beyond the hedge. Then the road rose again and the sun found them, and the world looked ordinary for a few minutes, as if it hadn't heard about the lake. Shamey fell quiet for a stretch, which was never a sign of peace. It was usually him thinking up something to say that would annoy a man at just the right angle. He rolled his shoulders, shifted again, and muttered something about ointment that Tiernan didn't ask to hear. A bird moved in the hedge, quick and low, and Shamey tracked it with his eyes, then spat once into the ditch, missing by a foot. He pointed suddenly with his chin toward a tree off the roadside.
Remind you of anything, Keane? He said.
Tiernan didn't entertain him. He kept Lasir at the same pace. He didn't change his posture. He didn't look where Shamey had pointed. Shamey continued anyway because Shamey never needed permission.
Crabapple, he said. Very similar in looks to hawthorn.
The tree sat a little back from the road, twisted and squat. Even from a distance you could see the thorny shape of it, the way it grew with a kind of stubbornness, branches going where they pleased. It did look like hawthorn in outline, if a man only knew hawthorn from stories and not from standing too close to one at the wrong hour. What's your point, Shamey? Shamey gave a little shrug, as if the whole matter was nothing.
Just an observation.
He let that hang, then waited until the road straightened and the hedges pulled back, as if he liked the space around his next words, and then his voice shifted, and Tiernan knew what was coming before it arrived.
Speaking of which, Shamey said, what's the story now after that little Kelly lass went and broke the last one?
Tiernan's gaze stayed on the road. He didn't like the way Shamey spoke names sometimes, like he was tasting them. He didn't ask Shamey to explain who he meant. He already knew. Things like that didn't happen often, and when they did, Tiernan kept them in a place he could reach without rummaging. I've resown it, over there beside Sceach Shiorai. Shamey made a noise of approval, like a man hearing a good decision. The sound came small and genuine, and for a heartbeat it didn't carry the usual mockery. Tiernan kept his voice plain. Mixed the soil with some old vessel dust that I had.
Aye, Shamey said, pleased. And?
Tiernan didn't hurry for him. He let the road do a few more paces. He let Lasir breathe. Then he gave the line, like he was reciting a rule he had learned by bruising himself on it. She'd be right as rain when the rain falls, Tiernan said. Shamey's eyes narrowed with interest, not mocking now, just sharp. He leaned in slightly on his pony, as if he didn't want the road to steal a word.
And by vessel dust, I assume you mean scrapings of objects once inhabited by spirits. Residual essence as feed.
Tiernan nodded. It was barely a movement, but Shamey took it as confirmation of something he'd respected in Tiernan long before the lake. Tiernan did things like a man fixing machinery. He didn't beg the world to behave. He made it behave with work. Shamey's mouth twisted into something like respect.
Clever thinking, lad.
Then Shamey asked, lightly, as if he hadn't been thinking it all along.
So what'll you use in the meantime?
Tiernan tapped the long leather pouch at his side with 2 fingers. The pouch had weight to it. It didn't swing like cloth. It sat there like something that belonged to a man who expected trouble and didn't intend to lose. The leather had been handled so often it had gone smooth in places, and the strap was worn in the way a strap only got worn when it had been trusted. I have my backup, Tiernan said, along with 1 or 2 other risky items if I'm absolutely stuck. Shamey made a sound that might have been a laugh and might have been a cough.
And sure, if you need my help, boy, don't be afraid to ask.
Tiernan's mouth shifted into the faintest smile, dry, brief, the kind that didn't soften him at all. It didn't invite friendship. It was just a flicker of humour a man allowed himself because he was tired and because Shamey had earned the right to be annoying. Like I said, Tiernan replied, 1 or 2 risky items. Shamey's eyes sparked. He took the insult as a compliment, which was the only way he knew how to take anything, and they rode on. The last stretch into the village had a different feel. The road narrowed, and the hedges closed in again, and the air carried smoke from the breakfast fires. But it didn't sit right. It wasn't the comforting smell of people awake and life starting. It felt like a cover, like folk were trying to keep normality in place by force. They reached the village by late morning, the road dropping into it as if the land itself was reluctant to let people gather there. The place had the feel of somewhere that should have been bright at this time of year, June, near the solstice, doors open, voices carrying, and yet the sound was dulled, held back. This is where you disappear, Shamey, Tiernan said, voice low. Shamey didn't miss a step. His pony veered toward a gap between 2 buildings without even waiting to be guided. He did it smooth, quick, as if he'd been in and out of villages like this 1,000 times and never once cared for what anyone thought of it.
Aye,
Shamey said, as if he was pleased to be told.
I'll go and I'll do what I do best.
Tiernan didn't ask. Shamey added cheerfully,
Sit in a ditch and listen to fools lie to themselves.
He was gone in a flash of small movement in old tweed, leaving only the pony's hoof marks for a few yards before they blended with the rest of the road. Tiernan rode on alone for a short stretch, Lassier's pace unchanging. He didn't look toward the gap Shamey had used. He didn't linger. He let Shamey vanish the way Shamey wanted to vanish. A woman stood outside a doorway with flour on her hands, staring at Tiernan without blinking until he passed. 2 men paused mid-conversation by a wall, then went quiet and watched him go, their bodies angled slightly away as if distance could keep them safe. A child ran across a lane, then stopped when he saw Tiernan and backed away without turning his back, like the child had already learned which things were best treated carefully. Tiernan felt eyes on his back from windows, from doorways, from behind curtains. The lake path, the one that should have been busy with boots and talk, was empty. No one walked toward it. No one even looked at it for more than a second. Tiernan turned his head slightly, just enough to see the lane that led that way, and then he faced forward again. A man waited near the chapel, half in shadow, as if he didn't want the building to be seen standing too close to him. Dano Gill. Tiernan recognized the set of him before the face. An ex-guard carried himself that way, even when he wasn't wearing the uniform. The habit never left, the way he watched corners, the way his hands rested, as if they were used to having purpose, the way his weight was balanced, ready to move without thinking about it. Dano stepped out when Tiernan drew near. Mr. Keane, Dano said, voice quiet. Tiernan didn't greet him. He gave him a look that said, Talk. Dano nodded, accepting the manner. You came. Tiernan slid down from Lassie without hurry, reins in his hands. Where is she? Dano swallowed. In the little room by the chapel. The priest doesn't like it, but he couldn't deny us. Show me, Tiernan said. Dano began walking, and Tiernan followed at his shoulder. Lassie came behind, led by a light pull, as if the horse didn't feel like waiting in the open with all those eyes. As they crossed the small square, Dano kept his voice low. You'll notice people watching, he said. I'm not blind, Tiernan replied. They're frightened, Dano said. Not of you, of the lake. Tiernan didn't answer. Dano went on anyway, because Dano had the air of a man who had to explain fear to people who didn't want to admit they felt it. They're calling it a murder, Dano said. That's how they're coping. If it's a murder, it's human. If it's human, there's rules. Tiernan's eyes stayed forward. And you? Dano hesitated. The pause said more than words would have. I've seen murders, Dano said. I've seen what men do when they think no one's watching. This isn't like those. They reached the chapel. It was small and old, stone dark with age, lichen clung in patches. The door was scuffed where boots had scraped it for decades. There was a quiet around it that didn't feel holy. It felt like avoidance, like folk had started treating the building itself as something that couldn't help. The door beside the side room was already half open, as if the priest didn't want to be the one to fully close it, and inside the air was colder. Not winter cold, this was June, but the kind of cold that clung to stone and didn't care what month it was. The room smelled of damp, lime wash, and something sharp underneath, like old blood cleaned badly. There was also the faintest hint of candle smoke, stale now, from a wick that had burned down too far. A table stood in the middle, with a sheet drawn over a shape. Tiernan stopped at the threshold. Dano waited, watching him, and Tiernan said, I'll see her first. Aye, Dano replied. That's why I sent for you. Tiernan stepped in. He didn't rush the sheet. He walked around the table once, as if he wanted to understand the room before he understood the body. He took in the corners, the window, the latch on the door, the shelf with the stub of a candle that melted down to a rough lump. The bucket in the corner where someone had thrown dirty water and forgotten it. The scrape marks on the floor where the table had been dragged into place in a hurry. And then he took the sheet. He pulled it back. The woman beneath was small-framed. The hair was dark, matted near the scalp where it had dried. The skin had a texture to it that made Tiernan's eyes pause. It wasn't just pale. It was pulled, as if time had tightened it and refused to let go. The cheeks sat wrong on the bone. The hands looked like they'd spent years by a fire, joints knotted and fingers too thin. Tiernan's eyes moved slowly, not lingering on what would make another man look away, because he'd trained himself out of that. He wasn't there to respect the dead by sentiment. He was there to respect the dead by getting the truth. He noted the apparent age first. Pruned up like a woman in her 70s, skin shrunken in a way that made the tendons in the wrists show too clearly. The lines in her face deeper than they should have been, the mouth slightly open, lips pale and dry, as if even the last bit of moisture had been taken. A drained look, as if whatever had been inside her had been drawn out and left the shell behind. His gaze dropped to her feet. There it was. The cuts at the backs of the ankles, clean and precise. Not torn, not ragged. Someone had known exactly where to place a blade. The skin around the cuts had the faint darkening of bruising, but even that looked restrained, like the act had been done without panic. Tiernan leaned closer without touching, eyes narrowing at the angle of it. Left-handed. He didn't say it. He didn't even let his face show the thought. He stored it away like a nail in a pocket, something small that could pierce later. The pattern was precise, not frenzy. Tiernan straightened. He let the sheet fall back into place with care, laying it down so it covered the shape without sagging. He didn't fuss. He just finished the act the way he finished every act, clean and exact. He turned to Dano and his voice was flat. "So, why me?" It landed in the room like a thrown stone. No drama, just a clean demand for sense. Dano hesitated. Tiernan watched him without blinking, letting the silence press Dano into the truth. Dano's eyes flicked once to the door, as if half of him wanted to leave the room and pretend he'd never walked in. Dano finally said, "Because this is Brona Tully." "And?" Tiernan replied. Dano's eyes flicked toward the table, then back. "We know her from the birthmark." Tiernan didn't move. "And?" Dano swallowed. "And, Mr. Keane, Brona Tully was 25 years old." The sentence sat there for a moment, stark in the cold air. Tiernan didn't react the way Dano expected. He didn't curse, he didn't step back, he didn't look at the body again in disbelief, he just absorbed it the way a man absorbed a number that changed the whole sum. Dano added quickly, as if he needed Tiernan to understand the scale of it before he dismissed it. "And this is the fourth body." He reached into his coat and produced folded papers, reports written with the guard's plain hand. The edges were worn where he'd handled them too often. He held them out. "This isn't exactly natural, Mr. Keane," Dano said. "You ask why you? Well, this is why." Tiernan took the papers. He didn't read them like a man making a show. He scanned, quick and exact. 3 more, dates, names, notes. Same lake, same withering, same cut. One report mentioned the state of the hands, another mentioned the lack of defensive wounds, a third mentioned how the face looked older than the father who'd come to identify her. Tiernan looked up. "The other bodies?" Dano nodded. "Same Achilles cuts." Tiernan's eyes went hard. "All of them?" "All of them," Dano said. "Same place, same angle, same neatness, like it was done by someone who'd done it before." Tiernan's gaze dropped again to the table, as if he could see through the sheet. He didn't speak for a few seconds, and in that quiet you could feel the change in him, the moment he stopped being a man being asked for help and became a man working on a problem. And then he asked, "Was there any signs of struggle?" "Some marks," Dano said. "Dragged grass, a torn cuff on one. Nothing that reads like a fight, more like people taken by surprise." Tiernan's mind moved on. "Any belongings missing?" Dano shook his head. "No jewellery stripped, no pockets turned out, no boot taken. That's part of what has them spooked. If it was a human killer, you'd expect something stupid." Tiernan gave a faint nod as if the answer pleased him for the wrong reason. He looked back down at the papers again, and his eyes paused on a small detail, notes about 2 victims, things the local doctor had observed in the hands, indents, calluses that sat where they shouldn't. The doctor hadn't known what it meant, but he'd written it anyway because he'd felt the strangeness of it. 2 of them had been left-handed. Tiernan didn't say that either. He didn't even let Dano see he'd noticed. He folded the papers slowly and handed them back. "How many in this parish?" Tiernan asked. Dano blinked at the shift, then answered at once. "It's 43. Tiernan's face didn't change. "I want them gathered." Dano's brows drew together. "All of them?" Tiernan's eyes fixed on him. "Did I stutter?" Dano's posture stiffened. Old habit. "No." Tiernan turned toward the door. He stepped out into the light of the chapel yard. The air outside felt almost too normal. June sun, a faint scent of cut grass somewhere, a bird calling as if there wasn't a lake nearby with bodies in it. The village carried on in small motions, a door closing, a bucket being set down, a dog barking and stopping as if it had remembered itself. Tiernan didn't let any of that fool him. He looked out over the roofs and the slope of land beyond, and in the distance, through gaps in trees, you could see the lake's dull shine. It looked harmless from there. It always did. Tiernan said nothing dramatic, no speech, no warning, no promise. He just stood there for a moment, eyes on the stretch of water, as if committing it to memory in a way that was personal. And then he spoke. Call a town meeting. And then he walked. Dan O'Gill gave him the directions at the chapel gate, speaking fast as if he could outrun the subject by hurrying the words. "It's the second lane past the Smiths," Dano said. "Stone wall on the right, ash tree leaning in over the gate, Concannon place. You see a shadow back." He said it all in one push, eyes flicking toward the road as if he expected the leg to walk up behind them and listen in. His hands kept moving too, a habit from old work. One thumb rubbed the side of his knuckle, then stopped, then started again. Tiernan nodded and swung up onto Lassie without ceremony. He didn't ask for company. He didn't ask Dano to wait. He rode out with the same measured pace he used for everything, letting the road take him where it would. The village fell away behind him in small details, a door closing softly, a child being called back in, the smell of turf thinning as he reached the last cottage, and Lassier's hooves found the rhythm of the lane, steady and even. The air had that June clearness to it, bright, without being warm enough to call it summer. Hedges were thick with leaf, a few wildflowers showed between stones, and somewhere a chain clinked as a gate swung in the breeze. Tiernan kept his eyes ahead. He didn't rush, but he didn't drift either. He moved as if every yard of road was part of a longer job that couldn't be hurried by impatience. The Concannon gate came into view exactly as described. A low stone wall ran alongside the lane, stones stacked by hand, some of them dark with age, some were pale where lichen had been scraped away. A rough timber gate sat between two posts, the wood greyed and scuffed, a chain looped twice and hooked on a nail that had been driven crooked. An ash tree bent in over the entrance like it had been trained to watch who came and went, its branches hanging low enough that you had to duck if you came through on a cart. Tiernan pushed the gate open and rode in. The yard was hard-packed earth with patches of grass worn down by boots and hooves. A trough sat near the well, water low, a rim of green at the edge where it hadn't been scrubbed in a while. A few old baskets leaned against the shed, one turned upside down like it had been tossed there. The house itself was small, whitewashed in places, the paint thin where weather had eaten at it. A window looked out onto the yard, curtains half drawn, the cloth faded by the years of sun. Before he reached the yard, he saw the shed. The door was half open, the light inside was dim. A man stood in the opening, broad in the shoulders, sleeves rolled up, a cap pushed back as if he wanted his face seen. Mick Concannon. Mick's eyes met Tiernan's and didn't soften. It was the sort of look men gave when they wanted you to know the ground was theirs, even if they didn't own the deed and couldn't pay the rent. It was a warning look, a look that said, "Don't think you can come onto my yard and speak over me." Tiernan slid down from Lassie and gave the reins a loose wrap around his hands. Civil for a start. He didn't square up, he didn't swagger, he didn't play the same game. "Afternoon," Tiernan said. "Mr. Concannon, I believe." Mick didn't return it. He looked Tiernan up and down as if weighing whether this was worth the bother. "You're the man they brought in," Mick said. Tiernan didn't bite at once. "I'm looking to speak with your daughter, Rosie Concannon." Mick's mouth twisted. "About what?" "About the incident at the lake, Mr. Concannon," Tiernan said. Mick leaned on the shed frame like he had all the time in the world. His forearm rested against the wood, casual, but his hand was tight, fingers curled like he was holding himself back from something. "She's a child," Mick said. "So I've heard," Tiernan replied. "That doesn't change what she saw." Mick's eyes hardened. "You can go on, you can ask your question somewhere else now." Tiernan let that sit. He didn't answer fast. He watched Mick's face and listened to the small sound of the place, a hen clucking somewhere out of sight, a creak from the ash tree as it shifted, and Lassie breathing slowly behind him. Then he nodded toward the shed. "You're busy here, are you?" Mick's expression held. "I'm fixing what needs fixing." Tiernan's gaze went past him, into the shed. Tools lined the wall on hooks. books. They weren't just kept, they were cared for. A spade stood with its blade scraped clean, metal bright. A saw hung with a sheen of oil on its teeth. A hammerhead shone as if it had been wiped after every use. Even an old shovel worn at the edge had been scrubbed until the metal showed. There was a neatness to it that didn't fit Mick's manner. It looked like someone who liked control. Then Tiernan's eyes found the box cutter. It sat on the shelf by itself, blade housing dulled, a bloom of rust at the edge where the thumb slide sat. It looked as if it had been wet and left wet. The rest of the shed had been minded, not a speck of rust to be seen. Tiernan just let his eyes settle there for a second, and then he looked away as if it meant nothing. His face didn't change. He didn't stare at it like a man making a point. He simply noticed it and stored the detail. He kept his voice polite, but the patience was thinning. "I'll speak with her now, Mr. Concannon, if it's all the same to you. Day is getting on," Tiernan said. Mick stepped forward a half-pace, chin lifted. "And if I say no?" Tiernan turned his head slightly, taking the full measure of him at last. It wasn't a challenging look. It was colder than that. It was a man deciding how much force would be required and whether it would be worth the hassle. Before Tiernan answered, the dog came into view at Mick's heel. Dilleen. A small thing, ribs showing through his coat. The tail was low. The eyes were watchful. It moved like an animal that had learned not to take up space. It didn't run up to Tiernan. It didn't bark. It hovered near Mick's boot, like it expected the next thing to be unpleasant. Mick shoved it aside with his boot, not hard enough to send it flying, just hard enough to remind it of its place. The dog stumbled and recovered, quiet. Tiernan saw this. He let it pass this once, the way a man might let a small offense go when he had a bigger purpose in mind. He didn't like it. He didn't ignore it either. He noted it, filed it away beside the rust and the look in Mick's eyes. He kept his tone level. "I'm not here to argue on your threshold, Mr. Concannon. I'll talk to Rosie and I'll be on my way, okay?" Mick gave him a look like he wanted Tiernan to beg. "Inside then, and hurry it up." Tiernan didn't thank him. He walked past Mick and into the house. The air had that slightly damp warmth houses got when the fire was kept in but the windows stayed shut. The light was low, curtains half drawn. It had the feel of a place that tried to look respectable for visitors, even when the money wasn't there for it. A rug lay over the center of the floor, frayed at one corner. A sideboard held a few plates stacked neatly, a jar of tea, a tin of biscuits that looked like it hadn't been filled in a while. Claire Concannon was by the table, wiping her hands on her apron. She had tired eyes, but her spine was straight. She gave Tiernan a cautious look and then a quick glance toward the hallway, as if checking whether Mick was listening, whether he was about to follow in and poison the room with his mood. An older girl sat on the chair by the hearth. Nell, 15 or 16, hair pulled back, arms folded. She looked at Tiernan with the guarded interest of someone who had already been disappointed by men more times than she should have. She didn't look impressed by him. She looked like she was waiting for him to prove himself one way or the other. And at the table, Rosie Concannon was drawing. She didn't look up. She was small for her age, 6 or 7, Dano had said, the crayon moving in short, sure strokes. She wasn't doodling for the sake of it. She was building something on the page, careful and absorbed, like the page was a place she could control when the world outside had started doing things she couldn't. Tiernan watched her draw for a moment, observing. He didn't speak over her. He didn't break the concentration like a man barging into a child's quiet. Claire spoke first, voice gentle but wary. "Mr. Keane?" Tiernan nodded. "Mrs. Concannon?" "It's Claire," she said, and there was a soft firmness in it, a woman stating how she wanted to be spoken to. It wasn't flirtation, it was dignity. Tiernan accepted it. "Claire." He looked at Rosie then, not looming, not trying to put fear into her. He lowered himself to one knee by the table so he was nearer her height. His coat creased as he did it. Last year's reins stayed in his hand, loose and controlled, a habit that didn't switch off just because he was indoors. Rosie's crayon kept moving, and Tiernan said quietly, "Rosie." Her eyes flicked up and met his for a second. There was no childlike grin, no easy friendliness. Her gaze was sharp, like a bird's, measuring and quick. Then she looked back down and kept drawing. Claire moved closer, her hand resting on the back of Rosie's chair.
"She hasn't slept right since," Claire said. "She wakes screaming about, well, you know."
Tiernan kept his voice plain. "I'm going to ask you about that night, Rosie, if that's okay. You can answer if you want. If you don't want, you can sit there and draw and pretend I'm not here." Rosie's crayon paused for a half a beat. Then she said, without looking up,
"Dilleen was with me."
Tiernan nodded at her and said, "I know, and I'm glad she was." Nell's eyes narrowed slightly at that, as if she hadn't expected Tiernan to say something like it. She watched him closer after that, not warmer, just more alert, and Tiernan said, "Tell me why you were down there, Rosie." Rosie's crayon moved again.
"Walking her. She likes the woods. Gets her away from..."
She was going to say her dad, but caught herself first, but Tiernan knew. The sentence stopped where it stopped, and silence filled in the rest. Claire added, quickly, as if she needed Tiernan to understand the routine,
"She always takes her out the back way, just down the lane."
Tiernan held up a hand, small gesture, not rude, just stopping the spill of words. He wasn't here for Claire's explanation. He was here for Rosie's memory. He looked at Rosie again. "And when you reached the reeds, Rosie, what did you see first?" Rosie's crayon scratched.
"Mud."
"And then what?" Rosie's mouth went straight and she put the crayon down. It wasn't a dramatic action, just done with the drawing for a moment. Her fingers rested on the table. Tiernan had watched that carefully.
"The dress,"
she said. Tiernan kept his tone low. "A woman." Rosie's eyes lifted to his face now. There was no tears. There was a kind of stubbornness there, like she was refusing to give the memory what it wanted.
"She was old,"
Rosie said.
"but at the same time she wasn't."
Claire's fingers pressed lightly into Rosie's shoulder, a silent comfort. Tiernan didn't prompt with suggestions. He didn't feed lines. He let Rosie choose what she could say, even if what she chose came out crooked. And Rosie continued.
"Her hair was all, it was all in mud, and her hands were wrinkly like Nell's old doll when it gets left near the stove."
Nell shifted at the mention, uncomfortable, but she stayed quiet. Tiernan asked, "Did you go close, Rosie?" Rosie gave him a look and said,
"I had to."
Tiernan didn't challenge it. He believed her. Children did that. They went closer because the mind tried to correct what it was seeing. Rosie said,
"The water moved."
Tiernan's eyes held steady. "How?"
"Like it was coming into her, like it wanted her."
Claire made a small sound. A breath caught, and then she pressed her lips together, holding it in. Her hand tightened on the chair back, knuckles paling. Tiernan let a beat pass and said, "And then you ran?" Rosie nodded. "And did you hear anything?" Rosie's eyes drifted toward the window, as if the answer was outside.
"It was quiet."
Tiernan waited. He didn't nod too soon. He didn't rush her into the next thought. Rosie added, almost reluctantly,
"But I thought I heard crying."
Tiernan didn't show satisfaction. He didn't lean in like a man hearing what he wanted. He simply stored it away. He stood, slow, and nodded at Claire. "Thank you, young Rosie," he said. "You've done very well." Rosie looked back down at the page and picked up her crayon again like she needed the motion. Claire looked at him closely.
"Will you catch whoever did it, Mr. Keane?"
Tiernan didn't offer comfort. He didn't offer promises. He said the truth he could stand behind. "I'll find out what's happening at that lake, Mrs. Concannon." As he spoke, Mick's voice rose outside, sharp with drink and bitterness. "Where's that useless dog gone?" Claire's shoulders drew in slightly, not in fear exactly, more in weary anticipation. It was a movement that said, "Here we go again." The dog barked, then a second time, not playful or a warning, just simply confused, and Mick's voice grew, words tumbling, the volume doing the work of sense. Then Dilleen yelped. It was a sound that cut straight through the room and left a thin silence behind it. Rosie's crayon stopped mid-stroke. Nell's jaw set hard, and Claire's eyes closed for a fraction of a second, like she was trying to hold her temper in by force. Tiernan turned his head toward the door. He didn't show anger, but the air around him changed. He became very still, as if stillness was a form of control. Claire's eyes dropped to the table. Nell's fingers tightened around her own arms. Rosie didn't move, but her crayon rolled slowly under her hand, back and forth, like it was the only thing she could control. Then Tiernan said, politely, "Excuse me for a moment." He stepped out into the yard. He didn't slam the door or rush. He walked with the same measured steps as before, but there was purpose in every one of them. Mick's voice came muffled, rough and careless. A brief ruckus followed, boots scuffing, something knocked. Mick's surprise turning into a grunt. A chair scraped. A dog's claws skittered on hard ground. There was a short, sharp sound like a hand meeting something it wasn't expecting. There was no shout from Tiernan, no threats carried into the house, just a short burst of movement and then quiet. A moment later, Tiernan came back in. His coat sat the same on his shoulders. His face looked the same, only his eyes had changed slightly, calmer and flatter, as if whatever he'd done outside required nothing emotional from him at all. Claire didn't ask, Nell didn't ask, Rosie didn't look up. Tiernan returned to the table and looked at Rosie. "Right," he said, as if they'd simply paused the conversation to let the kettle boil. "Before I head on, is there anything else you remember, Rosie? Any smells or sounds or anything odd?" Rosie stared at him for a second, then said, "Just the lake, that it was still." Tiernan nodded at that. He didn't ask her to describe still. He understood what she meant. It was the kind of stillness that didn't belong in a living place. Nell's gaze stayed on him. She looked like she wanted to ask what happened outside, but she didn't dare. Her eyes flicked once to the door, then back, like she was checking the room for danger the way older people did. Footsteps sounded in the hallway, and Mick appeared in the doorway. He had a slack look for a second, like the world had tipped and he hadn't caught up. His cap was crooked, one hand pressed at the side of his head, and his eyes blinked slowly, trying to find the room and fit himself back into it. He didn't look at Tiernan properly. He moved past the doorway and toward the back, muttering something to himself, then turned and went into the small bathroom, as if to splash water and pretend the moment hadn't happened. Tiernan didn't watch him go. He spoke to Claire, keeping his tone respectful. "Thank you, Mrs. Concannon," he said. "I'll be about the village for a day or two. I may call on you again." "It's Claire," she said. "Claire," Tiernan replied. Claire's cheeks had a faint colour to them that hadn't been there when he arrived. She kept her face composed, but she couldn't hide everything. There was a blush that rose and then steadied, like she was annoyed at herself for it. "And if you need anything," she said, "you can just ask." Tiernan nodded, already stepping back, and he gave Nell a brief glance. "Keep an eye on your sister." Nell's reply was sharp and honest. "I always do." Tiernan turned toward the door and raised his voice slightly, making sure it carried to where Mick would hear. "Mick," Tiernan called, loud enough. "I'm away." From the bathroom came a muffled sound. There might have been an answer, or might have been a curse, and Tiernan stepped out into the yard and paused near the dog. Dilleen stood by the shed wall, ears down, watching Tiernan with that careful animal gaze. There was a patch of coat missing near the shoulder where the fur had been rubbed away, skin showing faintly underneath. The dog's eyes kept flicking between the house and Tiernan, like it didn't know which way safety lay. Tiernan looked toward the water trough and the bowl beside it. "The dog's water bowl is low out here," Tiernan said, calling toward the house. "You might see to that, Mick, like a good man." A moment later, Mick came back out, still rubbing his head. He looked as if he wanted to ignore Tiernan out of pride. He stood in the doorway, swaying slightly, eyes narrowed, trying to gather anger like a man gathering coat and cap. Tiernan held his gaze steady. Mick's eyes flicked away first. He moved toward the bowl, reluctant, and lifted the bucket. He filled it. The water splashed into the bowl, loud in the yard's quiet, and Dillian flinched at the sound, then crept forward, sniffed, and began to drink. Tiernan didn't thank Mick. He swung up onto Lassier and rode off with suspicions sharpened, not confirmed. The pub room Dano arranged for him sat above the main bar, up a narrow staircase that creaked on the third step. The hallway outside smelled of cigarettes and spilt porter. Downstairs there were voices, laughter that rose and fell, but it had a strained edge, like people were pushing the sound out to fill gaps they didn't want to feel. The room itself was plain, a small bed with a thin blanket, a washstand with a basin that had a crack in the glaze, a chair that leaned slightly to one side, a sash window that didn't quite close properly, the bottom edge swollen from damp, and a little table under the window with a candle stub and a matchbox. The walls were bare except for a faint darker square where something had hung once and been removed. Tiernan looked around, taking in the corners and the shadows, then moved like a man checking a stable rather than a bedroom. He walked to the far wall, then looked down, checking under the bed, and he checked the latch on the door. He listened, not to the pub, but to the building itself settling around him. A dead mouse lay near the wall, stiff and dried, as if it had chosen the room to die quietly in. Tiernan, of course, didn't flinch. He crouched, picked it up by the tail, and stood. The weight was nothing. The fur felt dry. The little body swung slightly as he straightened, and his eyes went to the window. He went to the sash and lifted it with one hand. Night air slid in, cool and fresh. It carried the smell of hedges and damp grass, and somewhere below, bushes rustled, and a voice rose from the street, a laugh, and then silence again. The pub's noise didn't reach this height clearly. It came up muffled and distant, like it belonged to another building entirely. Tiernan leaned out and gave a short, sharp whistle. "Shamey?" There was a pause. Then the bushes below the window gave a lively shake, as if something small had taken offense at being summoned like a dog. Leaves trembled, a branch snapped lightly back into place, and Shamey's voice drifted up, annoyed and amused at once. "Do you mind?" he hissed. "Some of us are trying to work." Tiernan held up the mouse and let it dangle where Shamey could see it in the dim. Shamey's eyes caught the shape. His face lifted, and for a second he looked like a child spotting a sweet. "Ah," he said, tone changing immediately. "Look at you. You're a gentleman." Tiernan didn't smile. "Are you staying out of trouble?" Shamey climbed out from the bushes with a dramatic stretch, as if he'd been cramped by human hedges. He brushed his tweed and looked up, squinting because the window light hit his eyes at an angle. "Aye," Shamey said, "and I'll tell you this, Kane, go to the lake at some stage when it's quiet. I heard something down there, but I'm not sure, so I'll need you to double-check in case I'm off me rocker." Tiernan's gaze stayed on Shamey's face. He didn't look away toward the lake. He didn't scan the street. He gave Shamey his full attention in the way he always did when he decided something mattered. "Any sounds?" Tiernan asked. "Not constant," Shamey said. He lifted a hand and moved it in a short wave, like he was trying to explain with gesture what words couldn't carry properly. "Like something practicing, like a mouth learning a tune." Tiernan let that sit, and Shamey sniffed. "Also, what about that rodent there in your hand?" Tiernan dropped the mouse. Shamey caught it with quick hands and took it away as if it were a purse. "Much obliged, young Kane, much obliged." Tiernan didn't humour the young. He closed the window on Shamey as he spoke, not slamming it, just lowering it until it stuck halfway, then giving it a small shove to get it down properly. He stepped back from the window and set a bottle on the counter by the washstand. Laudanum. He placed it there with the same deliberate care he placed his other tools. Not for now, for later, if later came. The glass clicked softly against the wood, and the sound felt final in the quiet of the room. Tiernan sat on the edge of the bed without taking his coat off. He listened to the pub below, the rise and fall of voices, the clink of glass, and the way the buildings settled. He listened to the wind find a loose board somewhere and worry it gently. He listened to his own breathing, steady and controlled. Then he laid back and let the night pass, light and restless. The next day, Tiernan had Dano gather the 43 into the local hall. It took longer than Dano wanted. Men dragged their feet, and women brought children and kept them close. People arrived in clusters so they didn't have to walk alone. There was a sense of folk entering, not for the meeting, but to be counted as present, so nobody could later say they stayed away from something important. The hall had been swept, but you could still smell chalk and old wood and the faint sour trace of 100 damp coats on rainy days. Long benches lined the room. A table sat near the door with a ledger on it, ink, and a blunt pencil waiting. Tiernan stood at the front with his coat on and his hands still. He didn't pace. He didn't try to charm them. He didn't soften his voice for their comfort. When Dano moved beside him, Tiernan didn't lean in to whisper. He let Dano stand there and own his part of the thing. Tiernan asked simple, factual questions. Where were you the night Barona was found? Who was with you? Who used the lake path? Who has reason to be there after dark? What have you heard, and from who? He kept it plain. He kept it tidy. He didn't chase rumors into corners. He didn't call anyone a liar. He asked, listened, and moved on. He watched faces more than he watched mouths. He noted who looked to the door when certain words were spoken. He noted who held their tongue until somebody else spoke first. He noted who watched Tiernan's hands, as if trying to read what he was by how he stood. When it was done, he nodded toward the door. "Sign in this ledger on your way out," he said. "Name and address. I'll need it for my records, should I need to contact you again at a later stage." A few people exchanged looks, confused by the instruction, but they did it. They wanted to be seen cooperating. They wanted to be part of something that felt like control, even if it was only a name on paper. Tiernan stood to one side of the table as they signed, eyes lowered, as if he didn't care. Dano talked in his ear in short bursts, names and little bits of family history, and Tiernan listened without reacting. He watched the people sign. A man took a pencil in a grip that looked practiced. A woman held it differently, fingers tight, as if she didn't like writing in public. A boy signed in a quick scratch and ran back to his mother. A farmer pressed so hard the pencil almost snapped, leaving deep marks on the page. Another wrote light and careful, barely marking the paper. Tiernan's eyes tracked it all, quiet and exact. When the last person signed, Tiernan closed the ledger and placed his hand over it for a second, as if sealing it. Not superstitious, just practical, a man finishing one step before moving on to the next. They left with their unease intact, and Tiernan let them take it home. Outside the hall, the air smelled of sun and stone and the faint damp coming up from the ground. There were signs of preparation already, bunting half hung, a stack of chairs pushed against one wall, someone carrying a tray and setting it down like the world was normal, and dances still mattered. Claire Concannon stood by the steps. She wasn't alone. Nell was with her, arms folded, again eyes sharp, but Claire was the one who spoke. "Mr. Keane, there's an annual Solstice Dance tonight," Claire said, as if she was offering something normal to a man who lived in grim things. It's here in the hall. There'll be food and drink." Tiernan's eyes stayed on her face, reading her with the same quiet attention he gave everything. Claire held his gaze. She wasn't foolish. She knew what she was doing, and she did it anyway. There was a steadiness to her that wasn't flirtation. It was courage of a small kind, the kind that showed up in women who kept houses standing. "It might do people good," she added, then, softer. "And by people, I mean you. I mean, if you're not too busy with everything." Tiernan didn't embarrass her by pretending not to hear it. He kept his tone civil. "Thank you, Mrs. Concannon. I may pop by." Nell's expression said she didn't like the sound of it, but she didn't challenge her mother. She watched Tiernan the way she watched him in the kitchen, guarded and ready. Tiernan nodded and walked off, leaving Claire with her pride intact. That night, the hall filled with music and sweat and forced cheer. A fiddler played near the front, elbow working hard, chin tucked down over the instrument. A man on a tin whistle tried to keep up and didn't quite manage it, but nobody cared because the noise was the point. Boots stamped, laughter rose too loud in places, like it had been practiced, like folk had decided laughter was armour. Tiernan attended because it put people in motion. He stood near the edge with a drink he barely touched, watching. He didn't interrogate, he just watched. People moved differently when they weren't sitting on benches listening to questions. Their hands went where they went without thinking. A man lit a cigarette, the match held neatly practiced. Another lifted his pint and took a long swig, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. A woman tossed a coin to a child, quick and thoughtless. A lad threw a dart and grinned when it landed near the centre. A woman pinched a nip of snuff and brought it up with a motion she'd done since she was young. Tiernan stored these details like a stone in his pocket. Not evidence yet. Wait. And then he saw Nell in the corner. 3 lads had her pinned with their bodies, not touching her properly, but crowding her space, leaning in, grinning, making her work to breathe around their stink. One of them kept getting too close to her. Another blocked her path with his hip. The third laughed at something she hadn't said, like her discomfort was a joke they were sharing. Nell's face was hard, but her eyes kept flicking past him, searching for a way out. Tiernan looked for Mick, and Mick was there, slumped at a table, drink in front of him, head down like the world was too heavy to hold, watching it happen. Tiernan set his untouched drink on the table and walked over. He didn't announce himself, he didn't barge in, he stepped into the corner like he belonged there. One of the lads turned, already scowling. "Would you look? It's Mr. Ledger himself." Tiernan said, quiet, "I'll ask you kindly to take a seat." He pointed to the far end of the room. "Over there." The lad laughed. "Or what?" Tiernan didn't answer with words. He took the lad's wrist in one hand, turned it, and guided him down with smooth force, not flashy, efficient. The lad's knees hit the floor before he understood he'd been put there. The second lad came forward, swinging a lazy fist like he thought this was sport. Tiernan stepped inside it, used the lad's shoulder against him, and dropped him with a short, sharp movement that ended in the lad sprawling awkwardly on the boards, pride leaking out of him faster than breath. The third lad hesitated, eyes widening, pride battling sense. Tiernan looked at him as if he'd already decided the outcome. The lad stepped back. Nell stood there, breathing hard through her nose, trying not to show what the moment had cost her. Her hands were clenched, but she didn't cry. She didn't thank Tiernan either. She just stared at the lads like she wanted to do damage. Tiernan didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't put kindness on her like a coat. He simply nodded toward the open space. "There's a lovely cake over there," he said. "Go and have a slice." Nell didn't need to be told twice. She slipped away, face still hard, and vanished into the crowd, shoulders square like she refused to be small. Tiernan turned then and walked toward Mick. Mick looked up slowly, trying to focus. His eyes found Tiernan and then slid away as if he wanted to pretend he hadn't seen any of it. His hand went for his drink, fingers clumsy, and Tiernan leaned down slightly so Mick could hear him over the music. He didn't raise his voice. "You sat there," Tiernan said, "and watched your daughter get cornered like that." Mick's mouth opened, but nothing came out fast enough. His eyes skittered around the room, looking for an exit that didn't exist. Tiernan continued, calm and cutting. "A man can be poor, Mick," he said, "and still have enough spine to stand up when it matters. Be a fucking man." Mick looked down at his drink. Tiernan held the moment, letting it settle in. He didn't touch Mick, he didn't threaten him. He simply left the truth on the table between them and watched Mick shrink away from it. Then he straightened and left Mick with nowhere to look. Tiernan stepped back into the hall's edge and watched the room again. He kept his suspicions to himself. After the dance thinned out and the music died, Tiernan went to the lake for the first time. Shamey was with him at first. He'd appeared from somewhere in the village, like he'd always been there, pony, quiet on the lane, eyes watching light in the dark, as if he enjoyed night work too much. He didn't talk loud now. Even Shamey knew better at water. He trotted along at Lassie's shoulder, pony puffing softly, hooves making small, dull sounds on the ground. The solstice night sat over the land with a clean sky and a bright moon. Fields looked pale. The stone walls cut dark lines through the grass. Hedges cast hard shapes. The air held that damp smell that rose from low places and crept into sleeves. Shamey spoke first, voice lowered now.
"I told you," he said. "Down here, Keane. It's down here, I heard it."
Tiernan didn't answer. He didn't offer Shamey reassurance or doubt. He simply kept moving, letting the path lead them where it would. They reached the reeds, and the smell of lake mud rose up thick and real. The ground felt softer underfoot near the edge, a give that warned you not to trust it. The water sat still, as if it wasn't part of the world's movement at all. Moonlight lay in it flat and cold. Shamey stood a little back, eyes narrowed, watching the surface. He looked smaller there suddenly, like the lake had reminded him what size he truly was. Tiernan dismounted and went closer. He moved like a man approaching a fence he expected to climb. Shamey's head turned suddenly, and he sniffed the air like a dog. Then his voice brightened with hunger.
"Jesus, I smell a fine hare over there,"
Shamey said, and the words came out like he'd been starving for weeks.
"Off down in the woods beyond."
Tiernan didn't look at him. "Best not let him get away, Shamey." Shamey bounded off without waiting for permission, quick as a thought, and was swallowed by the dark trees at the lake's edge. Tiernan was alone. He knelt at the water. He took out the laudanum. The bottle was cool in his hand. The stopper came out with a soft pop. The smell rose sharp and sweet, cutting through the lake's damp. He took only enough to warm the edges of the world, not enough to lose himself, enough to open a door. Then he leaned forward and dipped 2 fingers into the lake, and he held them there. The cold of the water wrapped his skin. He didn't flinch. He didn't pull back. He waited as if patience was part of the method. It started as a sound inside his head, thin at first, then deepening, a keening note, sharp and human and wrong, slid in from the side of his awareness. It didn't come from the reeds. It didn't come from the trees. It came from somewhere that didn't care about direction. Then wailing, heavier, layered over it, rising like something answering the keening with hunger. The surface of the lake shifted in his sight. The pale shapes pushed up through it, dozens of them, heads and shoulders and arms, but not full bodies. Like the water wouldn't allow them to finish forming. They moved together, a slow press forward, like a line of men walking into battle without speaking. A single droplet of blood appeared, suspended in the air above the water. It hung there for a heartbeat, red against moonlight, then fell and vanished as it touched the surface. A man then stood out in the lake, water at his chest, hair plastered to his skull. He held pages in both hands above his head like he was presenting them to something. His mouth was open wide, and though Tiernan couldn't hear the words, he felt the force of the scream, a desperate demand that the world couldn't answer. A baby's cry then cut through everything, out of place and sharp and raw, a sound that belonged in a cradle and not near water. Hands too long and too sharp rose into view around the crying, fingers curling like hooks. They closed in as if the baby was a thing to be claimed. "Hush now." A voice, close and firm, said, "Hush now," like a mother trying to claim a child. The kindness in it made Tiernan feel worse because it didn't belong here. A raven flashed into his mind, perched and watching, eyes red as coals. It stared straight at him, as if it knew him, as if it had been waiting for him to look back. And then stillness. Everything went still. Too suddenly, the noise fell away, the shapes froze, the water became flat, and the world held its breath. "Be brave, my lad," said a soft female voice. A caw cut through the air, real and sharp, and Tiernan's eyes blinked and the lake returned to its proper shape. Steam rose from the water where his fingers were touching. It curled up and vanished into the night air. Tiernan stared at it for a long moment. He had expected many things from the lake. He hadn't expected the lake to answer him like that. A raven perched on a crooked branch nearby, watching him with the stillness that didn't belong to an ordinary bird. It didn't shuffle, it didn't fluff its feathers. It sat like a thing carved and set there on purpose. Tiernan said, "You again, from the orphanage? You've grown." The raven held his gaze without blinking. Shamey came back out of the darkness with a satisfied bounce in his step and a look in his face like he'd done something he shouldn't have.
"Found me hare," Shamey said. "Chased it like a fool, fell into a briar patch, and now I have lovely nettle marks in a place a priest wouldn't bless."
Shamey noticed Tiernan's quiet change. Then Shamey's grin faltered. He looked at Tiernan properly, at the way Tiernan's shoulders held, at the way his eyes stayed fixed, as if part of him was still listening to something the rest of the world couldn't hear. Shamey, for once, didn't joke. He didn't poke, he simply noticed. And as they left the lake, Shamey, too, noticed the raven as his demeanor changed a bit. The change in him was immediate and subtle. His shoulders settled, his mouth closed. The usual sharp humor drained away as if he decided the night was suddenly above jokes. He looked at the bird with something like respect, apology, almost. He didn't speak to it, he simply watched it as they walked away, as if he knew better than to make himself too noticed. Tiernan kept moving, eyes forward, carrying the sound of the vision with him, even after the lake had gone quiet again. Morning came in grey and thin, the kind that made the world look unfinished. Tiernan sat on the edge of the bed in the room above the pub, coat still on, boots still on, as if sleep had been a short pause he'd allowed his body and nothing more. The blanket beneath him was creased where he leaned back for an hour or two, but it hadn't been a night of rest. His posture was upright, his shoulders were squared. He looked like a man waiting for something to begin. His hands were calm on his knees. His eyes were not. They were focused without resting. They moved toward the window once, toward the door, then settled on nothing in particular. He held the after-image of the lake, the way a man's sight held the sun after he stared at it too long. Downstairs, the pub was already making its small noises, a broom across the floor, a pot moved, a voice speaking low, ordinary life doing its best to ignore the lake. Footsteps came up the stairs, firm and unhurried. Dan O'Gill knocked once and opened the door without waiting to be called in. He carried himself like a man who'd stood in enough doorways in his time to know when waiting invited trouble. He took one look at Tiernan and stopped short. "You're up early," Dano said. Tiernan didn't answer, not straight away. He was looking out the window at the pale morning outside and at the sliver of the road beyond. The sky held no colour yet. It was a washed-out grey that flattened everything it touched. Dano stepped fully into the room, careful with his boots, like he didn't want to bring mud into another man's space. "You went down to the lake?" Dano said. It wasn't a question. Tiernan's eyes moved to him, and the look was flat. "Aye," Tiernan replied. Dano watched him for a second, measuring the change he couldn't name. Tiernan looked the same posture, same controlled stillness, yet there was something in the way he held the room, as if he had found a new weight and decided to carry it without complaint. Dano cleared his throat. "Anything?" Tiernan stood, slow, and took his hat from the chair back. He brushed a line of dust from the brim with his thumb before setting it on his head. "Do you keep records?" Tiernan asked. Dano blinked once. "Records?" "Old ones. Anything on drownings, missing people, disputes, accusations, things folk wrote down when they thought paper would protect them." Dano gave a humourless half-smile. "Well, not here. This place is too small. Half the time the priests can't keep their own books dry." Tiernan waited. Dano nodded toward the road. The next town over's bigger. They've parish documents, land ledgers, court scraps, old notices, bits of it anyway. If it exists, it'll be there. Tiernan said, I'll be back later on today. Dano shifted his weight. Wait, I'll come with you. Tiernan looked at him as if he had asked to borrow his coat. No, Tiernan said. Dano made a frown. Mr. Keane? Tiernan cut in quiet. You've done what you can by bringing me here. If you want to be useful, stay in your village, keep your eyes open, keep mouths quiet, and keep people off the lake path. Dano's jaw moved like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. That was the ex-guard in him, recognizing a man who had already decided. All right, Dano said, but if you find something... Tiernan was already moving for the door. You'll know when you need to, Mr. Gill. You'll know when you need to. Dano stepped aside, letting him pass. Tiernan went down the stairs, crossed the pub, and went out into the morning without another word. The pub keeper looked up from wiping a counter and nodded. Tiernan nodded back and stepped into the lane. He walked a short distance up the road, far enough that Dano wouldn't see him from the pub window. He stopped by a stone wall where weeds grew through cracks and waited. He didn't call out or whistle, he just stood and watched the road. After a moment, the bushes by the ditch gave a small shiver, and Shamey appeared, as if he'd been there all night, folded into the land. He wore the same tweed, the same sharp little grin, same eyes that held too much.
And what's this? Shamey said. Not even an old scrapping a toast with some beetle butter for old Shamey.
Tiernan didn't humour him. Come on. Shamey looked him up and down.
Where are we off to?
Next town over, Tiernan said. Shamey's grin widened.
Right so, bye.
Tiernan turned and started walking toward where Lassie was tied. Shamey fell into step at his side, the way a shadow did when it decided it belonged to you. He didn't chatter much. The morning had something in it that pressed his usual nonsense down. They saddled without ceremony and took the road out. The land between villages rolled in low rises, hedges thick and damp from night. Fields opened and closed like pages. A cart passed them once, driver staring at Tiernan longer than was polite, then looking away fast. By mid-morning, the next town rose into view. It had more stone, more chimneys, more people. A place that believed it was separate from the land around it because it had a few extra buildings and a clerk who wrote things down. There was a small square, a pump in the centre, 2 shops with faded signs. Voices echoed differently here, bouncing off walls instead of drifting into hedges. The archive sat behind the chapel and the small court office, in a squat building that smelled of dust and damp paper. No romance to it, no grand library, just shelves and stacks, and a man with ink on his fingers who didn't like being disturbed. Shamey hid behind some barrels outside, per Tiernan's instruction. He crouched low, out of sight from the doorway, peering through a crack like a boy who had no business being there. Tiernan went in alone. The clerk looked up from the ledger, irritation already forming.
You're looking for what?
The clerk asked, before Tiernan had even crossed the room fully. Drownings, missing persons, public accusations, disputes over land by a lake outside Letterfrack, Tiernan said. The clerk's eyes narrowed.
That's a good spread.
Tiernan didn't smile. Can you help? The clerk grunted and nodded toward the back.
Parish records are in there. Flood notes in that stack. Death registries are bound. Court scraps are loose. And don't go mixing them up.
Tiernan placed a coin on the desk without flourish. The clerk's face softened by a fraction.
And don't go lighting any lamps. You'll set the whole place to ash if you're not careful.
Tiernan moved into the archive like he belonged there. He opened the back window slightly and Shamey climbed in, awkwardly, muttering under his breath about splinters and dignity. Dust lay thick on the table, on the ledger spines. The air held a damp chill. Light came through one window and hit the shelves in a pale strip. Tiernan removed his hat and set it aside. He rolled his shoulders once and began. They worked methodically. Tiernan pulled the parish books first. He ran his eye down names and dates, checking entries for drownings and burials that listed water as a cause. He traced columns with a finger, scanning margins where priests sometimes wrote what they didn't dare put in the main line. He shifted to the death registries, scanning for patterns in the months around the solstice over decades. He noted clusters, he noted gaps, he marked dates lightly on a scrap. He took down old flood records, pages swollen at the edge where water had reached them at some point, ink blurred in places, still readable if you took your time. Floods brought bodies sometimes. He wanted to see if any had been claimed by accident. He moved through notes of disputes, the kind where men accused each other of theft and trespass and witchcraft when they couldn't explain what had been taken. He popped his head out again and asked the clerk for anything connected to land near the lake. Boundary arguments, Tiernan said. Court words, claims of hearsay or madness. The clerk pointed him toward a box of loose scraps.
That's where we toss what no one wants to bind.
Tiernan opened it and began reading. He didn't speak his thoughts. He didn't narrate his work to Shamey. He simply moved from page to page, building something inside his head. Shamey didn't handle the paper like a child. He handled it like someone who had seen older, stranger books than these and knew how easily a page could tear. He worked more quietly than Tiernan had ever seen him. Tiernan worked the drownings and the missing persons. Shamey worked the accusations and the disputes. For a time, the only sounds were paper moving, the occasional grunt, and the faint drip of water somewhere in the building's bones. Tiernan found the first fragment in a parish margin note, penned small, as if the writer didn't want the word seen. A name, a man's name, half crossed out, as if regret had arrived mid-stroke. A short line beneath it. Went mad, by water, spoke hearsay, took to the lake at night. Tiernan didn't react. He made a note on a scrap of paper, neat handwriting, and moved on. A second fragment came from a court scrap, a complaint from a neighbour. He lights no candles, speaks to no priests, and makes marks in the mud as if the mud answers back. Tiernan's eyes held on that line for a second longer than the others. He kept reading. A third fragment, older, ink faded, spoke of a solstice night. Waded in with pages, said he'd proved them all blind, said the water would speak. Tiernan's fingers slowed. Shamey behind him made a small noise. Tiernan didn't turn. You found something? Shamey didn't answer with his usual bite. Tiernan looked over his shoulder. Shamey stood still with the single scrap in his hands, eyes fixed on the words. The grin was gone. The humour had drained out of his face, leaving something old behind it. Tiernan held out his hand. Give it here. Shamey hesitated, then passed the paper over, and Tiernan read it. The clerk's handwriting was different here, sharper. The words came from a man who had tried to sound sensible while writing about something that wasn't. Pages washed up after, Dork and the Grania, dotted in blood, no body recovered. Tiernan's gaze moved to the next line. Wailing heard for days. He set the scrap down and pulled another from the same box, as if the papers themselves were trying to cluster around the same story. On that note, the lake was mentioned by name in a margin note, squeezed in beside a land dispute. A simple line, almost casual. Beware water on solstice of the 10th leap. First it feeds, then the coming. Tiernan cross-checked dates. He pulled down a death registry from a decade later. Another line, missing, another drowned, another body found, aged beyond sense. He lined up years and months, letting the pattern form without announcing itself. He didn't tell Shamey what he was seeing. He kept it inside, assembling it as carefully as he had sewn the hawthorn. Shamey shifted beside the window, his eyes flicking from Tiernan to the glass and back again, as if he expected something to appear there if he watched it long enough. Tiernan found one more fragment, the kind that made the earlier ones lock into place. A parish note, written after the solstice entry, said, "After the coming, the lake was quiet, quiet as a grave, It was fed. Tiernan's face stayed composed. His mind moved quickly. The vision he'd had at the lake came back in pieces. The man standing in the water with the pages, the droplet of blood, the sound that had built from crying to wailing. Tiernan didn't share this aloud. He kept working. He tracked later disappearances across decades, each one small on paper, each one louder when you stacked them together. Shamey read over Tiernan's shoulder once, and his eyes narrowed. He stepped back again, and the quiet change in him deepened. Ever since he read the words, Dorka and the Grania. He had been talkative on the road, he had been crude by the lake. Here in this dusty room, his voice stayed locked away. Tiernan continued. He connected what he could, silently. A vessel, a lure, a feeding pattern, bodies aged like fruit left out too long, cuts made low at the Achilles, precise enough to immobilize without a frenzy of bloodshed. Blood offered, not spilled by accident. Tiernan didn't speak these conclusions even to himself. He let them sit. Shamey looked toward the window again. Outside, something moved across the pale light. A shape, a shadow passing. Tiernan didn't raise his head. He didn't give the moment the respect of attention. Shamey saw it, though. A raven, perched on the sill for a brief moment, red-eyed turned toward the room, and then gone. Shamey's shoulders went tight. Tiernan kept reading as if nothing had happened, and minutes passed. Shamey's hand drifted to his own chest as if checking he was still there. His gaze stayed fixed on Tiernan now, not with humor, not with annoyance, but with something that looked close to worry. Finally, Shamey spoke. His voice was lower than usual, almost careful.
Some places are meant to stay cursed by, Shamey said. Best we leave this one alone, okay?
Tiernan kept his eyes on the page. Why? Shamey swallowed. It was the first time Tiernan had seen uncertainty on him that didn't look like a performance.
This one's old, lad, Shamey said.
Tiernan turned a page slowly.
So?
Shamey's eyes hardened.
Older than you?
Tiernan's gaze lifted to Shamey's face. It wasn't anger, it was just attention. Shamey continued, voice sharpening, as if he needed the edge to keep himself steady.
Older than me? I seen these rituals, lad. They're dark dealings.
Tiernan's tone stayed flat. Is that so? Shamey leaned closer, eyes bright with frustration.
Aye, it is. I've seen men bring their pride to water and think the water will bow. I've seen them offer blood and expect obedience. I've seen what answers, lad.
Tiernan set the page down and spoke as if discussing a bill. People will get hurt, Shamey, good people. Shamey's laugh came out short and bitter.
But that's no reason for you to walk into your own coffin, lad. You may be a royal pain in the hole, but that doesn't mean I want to see your headstone.
Tiernan didn't rise to the insult. You invited yourself along for the fun, Shamey, if you're going to end up being a thorn in my side. Shamey's expression tightened.
This stopped being fun when you started looking at it like you could fix it.
Tiernan replied, calm. It can be stopped. Shamey shook his head, quick.
You don't stop something like that, lad. You survive it if you're lucky. You walk away if you have any sense.
Tiernan's voice stayed low. A child found that body. A village is rotting with fear, and you want me to leave it. Shamey's eyes flashed.
Just let the lake have its due.
Tiernan's face didn't change. No. Shamey pushed, words coming faster.
It's taken before. It'll take again.
Tiernan answered, still controlled. That doesn't make it right, Shamey. Shamey's lips pulled back, and for a second he looked less like a jester and more like a thing from older stories, something that had watched humans repeat the same mistakes until it grew tired of the pattern.
You think you're different,
Shamey said. Tiernan looked at him, and the quiet in his eyes wasn't pride, it was bleak certainty. I'm involved, Tiernan said. Shamey stared at him.
That's your excuse?
Tiernan said. That's the truth. The argument escalated without volume. No shouting, no slammed fists, just words placed carefully where they would cut. Shamey's voice sharpened to a point. Tiernan's stayed even. Shamey tried once more, the first hint of pleading creeping in despite his pride. Lads, Shamey said, softer, and Tiernan didn't soften back. Shamey, just go home, Tiernan said. Not back to the village, home, where you belong. Shamey went still. The silence that followed had weight. Shamey's eyes searched Tiernan's face for something he could see, a flicker of humour, a crack, anything. I'm serious. Leave. You've done enough here. It's time for you to go, Tiernan said. Shamey's jaw worked once, a glisten in his eye. Lads, Shamey said again, and there was something raw in it now, something he hated showing. I just don't want to see you hurt us all. Tiernan kept his eyes on the pages and didn't respond. Shamey's shoulders dropped a fraction, the way they did when a man accepted a door was closed. He didn't stomp out, he didn't curse, he didn't make it dramatic, he simply walked away, head low. He went back to the window, the one he'd climbed through, complaining, and paused with his hand on the frame. He looked back at Tiernan one last time. Tiernan didn't move. Shamey climbed out and dropped into the lane behind the archive. Tiernan heard his small footsteps fade, and outside a raven cawed. The sound cut across the damp air like a nail dragged on stone. Tiernan looked up at the high window. Shamey had stopped outside. Tiernan could see him through the glass, small shape in the lane, head tilted up toward the roofline where the raven sat out of sight. Shamey stared up for a second, and the look in his face was strange, something like apology. He dipped his chin once, very small, as if acknowledging a thing he couldn't argue with, and then he turned and walked away for good. Tiernan stood alone in the dusty room with the papers spread out in front of him. He didn't chase Shamey, he didn't call him back. He gathered the scraps, stacked them neatly, and slid them into the box again, returning each piece to the place that had been taken from, as if he owed the room that respect. He closed the ledger he'd been using, hand resting on the cover for a moment. His mind held the shape of what he'd found. The origin, the method, the vessel, the lake active again, awake in the way a thing woke when it tasted blood. He didn't speak any of it aloud. He didn't give it the satisfaction. He took his hat, pulled on his coat, and left the archive without looking back. Outside, the day had brightened slightly, though the cold remained. Tiernan stepped into the street and paused, letting the town noise roll around him. He made a decision. It was time to pay someone a visit. Tiernan went back to the Concannon house alone. No Shamey at his heel, no small voice behind him making a joke of it, just the road, the hedges, the weight of what he lifted from the papers in that other town. The morning had moved on, the light was higher, though the air still held a mild chill off the hills. The sun was there somewhere behind cloud, but it didn't give much heat. It only made everything look sharper, stones with their edges clear, puddles reflecting a pale sky, grass laid down in damp streaks where the wind had run its hand over it. Tiernan's boots struck the road with a steady pace that didn't change. His coat was buttoned, his hat was low. He didn't walk like a man arriving to plead his case. He walked like a man going back to a task he'd left unfinished. He came in through the gate without making a show of it, boots on stone, coat unbuttoned, hat low. The Concannon place sat as it had before, washed walls, smoke stains above the chimney, a yard that looked lived in rather than cared for. There were the usual signs of life in the house that was stretched thin, a bucket left upside down to dry, a worn broom leaned in the corner, the ground trampled in certain paths from the door to the shed to the trough. It wasn't tidy in the way money made things tidy, it was practical in the way survival made things practical. Tiernan didn't knock like a man asking permission, he knocked like a man returning to finish a sentence. The sound carried into the house and came back dull through the timber. A pause followed, the sort that told him someone inside had stopped what they were doing and measured the knock for meaning. Claire answered. Her face was drawn. She hadn't slept properly since the night at the lake. Even in daylight, her eyes held that fixed, tired watchfulness of someone who listened for trouble between ordinary sounds. She tried to stand straight away, as if posture could hold the world together. Her hands were dry from scrubbing, knuckles a little red. She had a faint smudge of flour or ash on the side of her apron, as if she had started something and abandoned it when she heard him. Her eyes met Tiernan's and stayed there. "Mr. Keane?" she said. Tiernan gave a small nod. "Mrs. Concannon." From the yard he could hear Mick, not a clear voice, not words, more the sound of a man moving things he didn't need to move. A shovel scraped, a bucket clanged, a cough. He was off to one side, keeping himself out of the doorway, like he owned the place and didn't need to look at anyone to prove it. Tiernan didn't look for him. He didn't give him the satisfaction of being the first thing noticed. "I need to speak with the girl again," Tiernan said. Claire's hands tightened on the edge of the door. "Rosie?" "Aye." She stepped back and let him in. The kitchen smelled of freshly baked bread. The hearth was low, but it had left its mark in the air. The table was scrubbed clean in the way desperate people scrubbed. The wood grain was raised in places from the scouring, and the surface had that dull, thirsty look of timber that had been cleaned too hard and too often. Nell was there too, quiet in the corner, watching Tiernan with a guarded look. Her hair was tied back, as if she'd been told to look presentable for a visitor and hadn't been in the humour. Her arms were folded, elbows tucked in close, the posture of someone who didn't want to show any weakness in front of a stranger. Rosie sat at the table, small shoulders hunched, gazed down. The dog was nowhere in sight, either put out or shut away or simply tired of the house. The absence of Dilleen made the room feel even smaller. The house didn't have the warmth an animal brought. It was just people and their nerves and the quiet between them. Rosie looked up when Tiernan entered. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She watched him like a child trying to decide what sort of man this was that had recently walked into her life. Her eyes were steady, and in that steadiness Tiernan saw something that didn't belong to a 6-year-old, the after effect of seeing a thing the mind couldn't make normal. Tiernan took off his hat and held it at his side. He didn't soften his face for her. He didn't harden it either. He kept it honest. "Morning, Rosie," he said. "Morning," she said, small voice, steady enough. Tiernan's gaze moved briefly to Nell, then to Claire again. "I'd like a word with her," Tiernan said, "in private." Nell shifted, about to object. Her chin lifted a fraction, a quick spark of protectiveness that made her look older than she was. Claire lifted a hand, slightly, not even a full gesture, and Nell stopped. "Do you want me to leave the room?" Claire asked. Tiernan didn't blink. "Just for a few minutes, please." Claire looked down at Rosie. Rosie's fingers were on the edge of the table, rubbing the wood grain as if it might give her an answer. The small movement was repetitive, almost automatic, like the child was keeping herself anchored with texture. Claire leaned in and kissed the top of Rosie's head. "I'll be right outside," she said, the kind of promise mothers made when they had no control over what came next. She nodded to Nell. Nell stood reluctant and followed her out. As she passed Tiernan, she gave him a look that was sharp without being disrespectful. It said, "If you hurt her, you'll answer to me." It was bold for a girl in that house, and Tiernan noted it. Tiernan waited until he heard the door into the yard close. Now it was only him and the girl in the kitchen, and the quiet changed. It wasn't the quiet of an empty house. It was the quiet of a room where something important was about to be said, and neither person wanted to waste words. Tiernan didn't rush her with questions. He took out a seat, not across from her like an interrogator, but to her side, angled so she didn't have to stare straight at him. He sat with enough space between them that she didn't feel crowded. He placed his hat on the chair beside him with care, as if keeping the motion small might keep the room calm. He looked at Rosie as if she were a person, not a clue. "You're not in trouble," he said. Rosie's eyes stayed on him.
"Am I not?"
There was suspicion in it. Children knew when adults tried to cover fear with kind voices. Rosie's question wasn't childlike, it was practical. Tiernan replied, "No, you're not." Rosie's voice came out a bit thin.
"Mammy said you're here to help."
Tiernan's mouth moved slightly, almost a smile, almost not. "I'm here to stop it, Rosie," he said.
"Stop what?"
Tiernan didn't answer that yet. He reached into his coat and took out a folded sheet of paper and a stub of charcoal. Ordinary things, nothing that would frighten a child on sight. He unfolded the paper slowly and flattened it on the table with the side of his palm. He placed the charcoal next to it. Rosie looked at the paper, then at his hand, then back at the paper. Tiernan kept his tone casual, like he was buying himself time. "I want you to draw for me, Rosie," he said. Rosie's confused expression came and went fast, more of a crease of concentration than a face made for drama.
"Draw what?"
Tiernan didn't give her a big speech. He didn't dress it up. "The night at the lake," he said. "Whatever you remember best. The bit that won't leave you alone." Rosie stared at the paper for a moment longer. Her fingers hovered, then she pulled her hand back as if thinking she shouldn't touch it. Tiernan waited. He didn't push, he didn't fill the silence. Then Rosie reached out. She picked up the charcoal in her left hand and began to draw. Tiernan didn't flinch or lean in. He didn't show anything at all. He simply watched Rosie's wrist move, watched the way she held the charcoal, watched the pressure she put on the page. The charcoal made a soft scratch as it met the paper. The lines were dark and blunt. Rosie wasn't trying to make something pretty for approval. She was putting down shapes the way a person marked a warning. She drew in quick, simple lines, trying not to make it pretty. A black oval for the lake, tall strokes for reeds, a small figure, stick-armed, then a long shape at the edge of the water. The shading was so heavy the paper began to shine slightly where the charcoal waxed it. Tiernan kept his face steady. He gathered himself internally, the same way he gathered his coat when he stood, the same way he gathered his temper when men pushed him. He let Rosie draw until her line slowed and her hand hovered, unsure. Rosie glanced up at him.
"Is that enough?"
Tiernan said. "That'll do." Rosie put the charcoal down. The charcoal left a black smear on the side of her finger. She rubbed it against her thumb without thinking and made it worse. Then she stared at her hand, as if surprised to find the stain there. Tiernan didn't praise her. He didn't tell her she was brave. He didn't give her the comfort that would rot later. He reached into his coat again. He took out a simple object, a small coin threaded onto a short length of chain, the sort of thing a man might wear tucked under his shirt, plain enough to be overlooked. He didn't swing it like a stage trick. He didn't make it a performance. He held it so the light from the window caught it, a soft glint, steady and small. Rosie's eyes went to it without thinking. Tiernan's voice lowered, not soothing, just controlled. "Look at that for me," he said. "Just the coin, nothing else." Rosie's gaze fixed on it. Tiernan kept the coin still, letting the light do the work. The glint didn't flash. It sat there on the edge of sight, something the mind could hold on to without strain. "Keep looking," Tiernan said. "You don't have to talk yet." Rosie blinked, slow. Tiernan watched her face with attention. He watched for the moment her focus settled fully, the moment her eyes stopped flicking around the room for escape. "Rosie, tell me where you were the night before you went down to the lake and saw what you saw," he said, plain and short. Rosie's mouth moved before her mind caught up. "Down. Down where?"
"The water."
"And who were you with?" Rosie's eyes stayed on the coin. Dilly, my dog. We used him. Tiernan didn't move. You used him? How? Rosie's brow creased slightly, like she was trying to remember a sentence she'd been taught. She didn't sound like a child inventing a story. She sounded like someone repeating instructions that had been placed in her. We said he was drowning in the water. Tiernan's eyes stayed on the coin. Who did you say that to? Rosie's lips parted. Help me. And they came. They came. And what happened then, Rosie? Dad's knife. Tiernan's gaze didn't waver. And where was the knife? Rosie's words came back, broken and scattered. Behind my back. And what did you do with it, Rosie? Rosie's hands lifted slightly, as if she could feel it, as if the memory had weight. Her fingers curled and opened again. Backs of the legs, she said. Then she added, quick and small, as if she needed to say it even in that distant state. I didn't want to, but I was scared. And what did you do, Rosie? Rosie's eyes stayed fixed and distant. When I cut them, they couldn't run. And then what? Tiernan asked. Rosie paused. The pause was long enough that Tiernan could have pushed and made her babble. He didn't. He let the silence do its job. Then, softly, as if repeating something she had heard whispered in a dream, the blood woke it up, Rosie said, and it came for them. Tiernan held that line for a second and let it settle. He didn't push her for more than she could give without collapsing into nonsense. He didn't turn it theatrical. He didn't let it become a child's horror show. He simply said, all right. He lowered the coin and let it drop back into his palm. Rosie blinked again, faster. The dreamy slackness left her voice. Her eyes darted, finding the room again, the table, the window, the hearth. She looked down at her own hands as if checking they belonged to her. Tiernan put the chain away. He didn't touch her. He didn't clap his hands. He didn't snap her out like he owned her. He grounded her with the room. Look at me, he said. Rosie looked at him, eyes clearer. Her expression tightened, confusion tugging at her. What's your mammy's name? Tiernan asked. Rosie frowned. Claire. And your sister? Nell. Tiernan nodded. Good. Rosie's gaze went to the paper with the drawing, as if seeing it for the first time. Tiernan slid the paper toward himself and folded it once, careful not to smudge it more than it already was. He folded it again, smaller, until it was a compact square he could keep. That's enough for today, Rosie, he said. Rosie's voice came out smaller. Am I bad? Tiernan's eyes held hers. The question wasn't just guilt. It was fear of being blamed. It was a child's attempt to make sense of why her own mouth had said things she hadn't meant to say. No, Rosie, Tiernan said. Not at all. Rosie looked down, tired. Tiernan rose, composed, and went to the door. He opened it and called out, Mrs. Concannon. Claire's footsteps came quickly. She entered alone, worry on her face like a bruise. Her gaze went straight to Rosie, scanning her for damage. Rosie sat still, shoulders smaller than before. Tiernan didn't speak in front of Rosie, not yet. He looked to Claire and said, polite, Could I have a private word outside? Claire glanced at Rosie, then back to Tiernan. Of course, she said, and followed him out. They stepped into the yard. The air hit them clean. It smelled of damp soil and a faint hint of something sour from the trough. From this angle, if you lifted your eyes past the fields, you could imagine where the lake sat, out like a dark thought the land refused to forget. Claire went straight to the stone wall and leaned on it, hands gripping the top stones, as if the earth itself might try to tip. Tiernan joined her, not leaning, just standing close enough to be heard. He kept his body angled so he could see the shed without staring at it. Mick was still off to one side, half in the shed, moving something again, pretending he wasn't listening. He was listening. Tiernan didn't look at him. He spoke to Claire, and he gave her everything he'd been holding back. He did it with no speeches and no softness. He did it like a man laying tools on a table. In the morgue, the cuts were low at the back of the leg. They were clean, same place every time, Tiernan said. Jesus, she said. Tiernan continued. She looked aged, not from the water or rot. It was like time had been pulled through her. Claire's eyes flicked toward the field. Brona. Tiernan nodded. Claire's hand went to her mouth. She didn't cover it fully. She didn't want to hide her reaction, but she couldn't help it. Her fingers pressed there as if stopping words from spilling out. Tiernan's voice stayed steady. She was the fourth. Claire let out a slow breath. I didn't want to keep count, but yes, I know. That's why they called you, Tiernan said. Dano gathered the parish. You saw that yourself, the 43 residents. Claire looked at him, confused. I know, to ask us questions. Well, because of you've a thing taking bodies, Mrs. Concannon, you look at the hands. Claire, she said. Claire. Hands. Tiernan didn't over-explain. He gave her the bones of it. I watched them sign the ledger. I watched who used their left hand and who used their right. Grip, pressure. Claire's eyes widened. You watched them write their names? Tiernan nodded. And last night at the dance, I watched again, smoking, drinking, throwing darts, handling coins. Claire's mouth opened slightly, then closed. What did you see? Tiernan kept it credible. He didn't pretend he'd solved the world with one look. In a parish that size, Tiernan said, you'd expect a handful to favour the left. 3, 4, sometimes more, sometimes less. Claire stared at him. And, Tiernan replied, all the people I saw were right-handed. And Claire swallowed. So, you're saying? I'm saying the left-handed ones are scarce in the parish. Claire's brow creased. But could it not be from someone the next town over, someone passing through? Tiernan didn't dismiss it with a lazy answer. He placed it properly. If it was a stranger, you'd have talk. Someone new in a place like this stands out. Dano would have heard it. He used to be a guard. He gets told things by men who think they're whispering. Claire's eyes flicked toward the pub road, as if imagining gossip running through it, and Tiernan continued. And the cuts, those weren't made in a hurry. Whoever does it knows the paths, knows the lake, knows where to stand so no one can see them. A stranger could try, but they'd be noticed sooner than later. Claire leaned harder on the wall, as if the stones might steady her, and Tiernan continued. I went to your shed the first day and I saw tools, cleaned, minded. Mick keeps his tools, yes. Tiernan kept his voice flat. One stood out, a box cutter, more rust than the rest, like it had been wet and just left that way. What are you saying, Mr. Keane? The story that brings people down there, Mrs. Concannon, is a helpless child and a dog. Claire's eyes went wide with a fresh kind of horror. Rosie? A child is trusted. A child is the perfect lure. Claire shook her head slowly, as if her body refused the idea. No, she'd never. Tiernan's voice didn't raise. I asked Rosie to draw. She used her left hand. Claire's face drained. Her mouth worked, as if trying to find a word that could fix it. It didn't come. Tiernan looked out toward the field where the land dipped away, towards where the lake would sit beyond sight, and then he said the core truth, simple and firm. Your girl is being used as a vessel, Mrs. Concannon. Whatever haunts that lake is parasitic. It feeds through her because she's young and easy to steer. It hides behind her because people will always come when a child asks for help. Claire's eyes filled, but she didn't let anything fall. She held it in by force, jaw tight, hands like gripping stone. Had anyone looked closer at her eyes that night, my guess is they might have seen they were darker than normal. It happens in possessions, Tiernan said. Claire pressed her lips together the way a person did when they're trying not to make a sound, her gaze fixed on the yard as if she couldn't bear to look toward the lake, even in imagination.
That's not my Rosie,
she whispered. Tiernan replied, It's still your Rosie, and that's the point. It uses what's already there. Claire's hands gripped the stone until her knuckles showed pale. Tiernan didn't reach out and didn't touch her. He didn't offer comfort with empty words. He kept his voice stable because she needed stability more than kindness. It can't go on, Tiernan said. It'll keep feeding, and tonight matters. Claire looked at him, and there was panic trying to climb into her face.
Tonight,
she said. The solstice. Claire's eyes darted toward the far field again, toward the invisible lake. Tiernan continued with his voice low. I found what I needed in the records, a pattern. This thing was stirred once before on a solstice night. It won't wait long now. It's close. Claire shook her head, desperate.
Well, what do we do?
Tiernan spoke without drama. I confront the lake. Claire's voice broke slightly.
And Rosie?
Tiernan looked at her, calm as stone. You keep Rosie inside. You keep her watched. You don't let her wander, not for a pail, not for a dog, not for anything.
And if she tries?
Tiernan's eyes stayed steady. Then you hold on to her, Mrs. Concannon. A small sound came from the shed, Mick shifting perhaps, or Mick listening harder. Tiernan finally turned his head slightly, just enough that Mick would know he was seen. Not a glare, a quiet acknowledgement. Mick didn't step out, he stayed in the shadow. Tiernan turned back to Claire. You're out of time, he said, not as a threat, but as a fact. Claire nodded, trembling held in check. Tiernan stepped back from the wall. He didn't look at the kitchen window. He didn't look at Rosie. He didn't indulge the emotion that would pull him off task. He headed for the gate. Behind him, Claire called his name, sobbed. Mr. Keane. Tiernan stopped and looked back. Claire's eyes were wet now, and her voice was trying to stay strong.
Please help my little girl.
Tiernan didn't promise what he couldn't guarantee. He gave her something else. I'll stop it, he said. Then he left the yard, boots on stone again, shoulders square, mind already moving toward the water. Tonight had meaning. Tonight had teeth. And Tiernan Keane walked away from the house, knowing the road ahead was narrowing fast. Claire Concannon shut the back door with her shoulder and called Rosie's name into the kitchen, as if the child might answer from under the table, but there was no answer. The sound of the door closing had been too quick, too abrupt. It seemed to leave an echo behind it. The latch caught with a dull click that usually meant safety, but today it only made the house feel smaller. The house had that half-lit evening look it got before a storm, lamps already needed, day not properly gone. The light through the window had a strange tint, more bruised than gold, and it didn't sit right on the table or the floorboards. Outside, the sky had turned an ugly colour that didn't belong to any season she trusted. It wasn't the honest dark of night arriving. It was a heavy, stained shade that looked like weather with a temper. The air carried a strange pressure, like the world was pushing down on the roofs. Claire stood in the kitchen for one moment longer than she meant to. Her hand stayed on the door frame, and she listened. A house always gave itself away when someone was in it. Small feet on boards, a chair scrape, the tiniest breath of movement through curtains. She heard nothing except the soft, uneasy shift of the building settling. The sound of the lamp flame was there too, a faint little hiss, as if it was nervous. "Rosie," she called. and her voice came out sharper than she intended, the word almost snapping at the walls. She hated that. Rosie didn't respond well to sharpness, and Claire had been trying since the lake to keep her own voice steady, but still there was nothing. Nell had been hovering by the window, restless, bored of being told to stay in. She was old enough to want her own evening, old enough to think she knew the roads by heart. She had been tapping her fingers on the sill, watching the lane as if friends and freedom might appear if she stared hard enough. When Claire came in, Nell had turned from the glass with a look that said she was sick of being locked up like a child. "Where is she?" Claire asked, though she already felt the dread of the answer. Nell lifted one shoulder in a shrug that tried to look careless. "I dunno, she was here." Claire moved through the rooms again, quick hands searching corners they already knew were empty. She checked the small back bedroom, the one Rosie sometimes crawled into with Dillian when Mick was in a foul humour. The bed was made in the same rough way it had been made this morning. The blanket lay folded at the foot. Rosie's worn coat was hung from a peg. Her little boots weren't by the hearth. Claire's eyes went straight to the detail and stayed there because her mind had learned lately to fix on small signs. She checked the corner by the hearth. No child crouched there, no small shape tucked into shadow. She moved into the front room and looked behind the chair, behind the table, into the narrow gap where the turf basket sat. She checked the pantry space, half expecting Rosie to be standing there guiltily with her hands in the biscuit tin. She opened the door to it anyway, nothing but sacks, jars, and the smell of old flour. She checked the yard through the panes. The yard looked off under that sky, unnatural. The ash tree over the gate held its leaves still, as if it was waiting. The shed door was closed. The trough sat half full, surface of the water tremoring from the pressure in the air. And there was no dog. Still nothing. "Rosie," she called again, and the word came out sharp with fear. A gust pushed at the chimney. The flame in the lamp shuddered and dipped, then recovered. For a split second, the shadow of the room jumped, corners stretching and shrinking as if the house itself had flinched. Claire went back to the back door and stared at it as if the door could tell her what had happened. She laid a hand on the latch without thinking, and then she noticed it. The latch was loose on the back door, not fully open, but not properly caught either. The timber had a slight give to it, the kind you only saw when someone had slipped out in a hurry and pulled it shut behind them without caring if it held. Her eyes dropped to the nail on the wall. The dog's lead was gone. Dillian. Her hands went cold with the kind of certainty she didn't want. It was a clean certainty. It didn't come with doubt. It landed in her like a stone and sat there. Rosie had gone out. Rosie had taken the dog. Rosie hadn't asked permission. The memory of Tiernan's face in the yard came back, not comforting, just clear. Keep her inside. Keep her watched. Do not let her wander. Hold her. Claire stood there, hands still on the latch, feeling the absurdity of it. She had watched Rosie all day. She had kept her within sight. She had kept the back door shut. She had done everything a mother could do in a small house with a man like Mick and a sky like that. And still the child was gone. Outside, Nell pulled her shawl tight over her shoulder without looking back, already moving toward the door as if action might stamp out panic. "I'm only going up the lane," Nell said. "I'll have a look." "Nell," Claire started, because Nell had no business chasing anything under that sky, not with the lake involved, not with Rosie involved, not with whatever had been riding the edges of their lives for days. But Nell was already moving, young legs taking into the darkening yard, the sky turning heavier above her. The door opened and the air outside rushed in, damp and sharp. Nell's boots hit the stones and she was gone. The shawl pulled up around her shoulders, head down against the first bit of rain. Claire stood in the doorway, listening, and felt the first drop of rain land on her wrist like a warning. It struck like a small sting, like the sky had thrown it with intent. She looked up at the cloud cover and saw it pushing in, low, darker at the belly, and the air seemed to press even harder down the lane, down into the hedges, down into every hollow in the fields. The world had that charged quiet it got right before a storm properly broke. Birds gone still, insects gone still, even the leaves holding themselves in place. Claire swallowed and stepped out. closing the door behind her with a hand that didn't feel like her own. She stood for a moment on the step, torn between running after Nell and staying near the house in case Rosie came back. She listened again, straining for the sound of feet, for the bark of a dog, for anything that might give her a direction. She heard only the first rain gathering courage, tapping the roof and the yard in scattered beats, and far away, so faint she couldn't trust it, a thin, steady sound that might have been the wind, and might not. Rosie walked barefoot through the trees as if her feet didn't feel the ground. The lane had given way to the thin path quickly, the sort of path the locals used without thinking, worn into the land by boots and carts over years. But Rosie didn't follow it properly. She went straight through the brush where a sensible child would have slowed. Brambles tugged at her arm. She didn't notice. Wet leaves stuck to her ankles. She didn't care. Small branches dragged across her coat sleeves and left damp streaks, and still she kept going. Her feet should have flinched at stones. They should have stopped careful around nettles, but they didn't. They moved in a steady line, one after the other, like she was being drawn by a string. Her eyes were open, yet not looking at the world the way a child normally looked. A child looked everywhere. A child noticed everything. A child stopped for a beetle, a mushroom, a bird hop, a stick worth picking up. Rosie did none of that. Her gaze stayed forward, fixed through the trees, as if the path wasn't made of earth and leaves, but something only she could see. Above the tree line, the sky had darkened too quickly, the kind of storm dark that made birds go quiet. There was no proper lead-up to it, no slow roll, just a hard turn, as if someone had pulled a curtain across the evening. The smell of rain came in first, sharp and metallic, like stone being washed. Then the earth scent rose, rich and damp, as if the soil had been waiting all day to breathe. The trees stood close, their branches stirring in the building wind. Somewhere deeper in the wood, something knocked against something else, branch on branch, a hollow sound like a warning drum. Rosie's lips moved once or twice, soundless. Her mouth shaped words she didn't say aloud. The movement was slight, like a child whispering to a doll, but there was no doll. There was only the air. Something carried through the air that no one else heard. No words, no song either. A far-off keening, thin enough to mistake for wind, but steady in a way wind never was. It didn't rise and fall in gusts. It didn't change direction. It held its note, persistent, patient, and Rosie walked toward it. Rain began as a fine spit through the leaves. It dotted Rosie's hair and made it cling in strands. The drops gathered on her lashes. She didn't blink them away. The woods opened slightly and then narrowed again, the land dipping toward lower ground. The deeper she went, the darker it got. The soil underfoot turned darker. Patches of mud appeared where the water had no place to go. If she had been herself, Rosie would have avoided those patches and complained later about dirty feet and wet cold. She walked through them without noticing, leaving shallow prints that filled with water behind her. A shadow crossed the path ahead. Nell, moving fast, head down against the first rain. Nell's breath came hard from running. Not from fear exactly, more from anger at being dragged into this, anger at Rosie for slipping away, anger at her father for being useless, anger at the sky for turning on them at the worst time. It all tangled together and made her legs go faster. She didn't know what she was chasing yet. She only knew her mother's voice had gone brittle. She pushed through a gap in the hedges where the branches caught at her shawl. She yanked it free and kept moving. Her boots sank slightly into wet soil and made that sucking sound that always annoyed her. She didn't slow. Then she saw movement in the trees and stopped. "Rosie," she called, voice cutting through the rain. The sound of her sister's name bounced off trunks and came back dull. For a second, there was no reply, only that thin keening, so faint Nell couldn't hear it, thread under the storm like a secret. Rosie's head turned. For one sharp moment, her gaze looked deep and dark, as if her eyes were full of storm water. Nell felt something in her stomach go hollow at the sight of it, not knowing why, only knowing that the look was off. Rosie's eyes usually had a quick brightness to them, even when she was scared, but this was different. This was weight in a child's face that didn't belong. Then Rosie snapped her voice out like a rope thrown to pull Nell close. "Dilleen, no." The sound had panic in it, small and raw. It was the voice of Rosie as Nell knew her. It hit Nell hard because it sounded real, and it made Nell forget the strange look entirely. Nell's whole body reacted to the sound of her sister's panic. She moved toward Rosie without thinking, pushing past a low branch, boots sinking and slipping in the muck. Rosie stepped forward from the trees, and to Nell she looked normal again. Pale face, wet hair stuck to her forehead, shivering shoulders. The child's mouth quivered.
"Rosie, what are you doing out here?"
Nell demanded, voice rough with relief and anger mixed together.
"Mammy's near tearing the house apart looking for you."
Rosie's mouth worked, as if she was repeating a line she'd said before.
"Dilleen ran," she said. He ran in the water."
The words came out dreamily. Nell's anger faded into hard fear.
"Whereabouts? Point it out."
Rosie nodded quickly.
"That way. I can't get him. Nell, please help."
She sounded pleading. She sounded small. She sounded exactly like a child who'd made a mistake and needed her older sister to fix it. Behind Rosie's back, her small hand held something that didn't belong in it. A box cutter. The metal looked darker than it should in the storm light, wet along the edges as if it had been dipped. The housing was familiar, the kind a man kept in a shed, the kind Rosie had no reason to be carrying. The blade was slid out just enough to gleam. Nell didn't see it. She took Rosie by the shoulder, fingers firm, half scolding, half comforting.
"Where is he? Whereabouts?"
Rosie pointed through the trees towards where the land dipped. Nell stepped past her, eyes in the direction, already picturing the dog sliding in the mud, already picturing her mother's face if something happened. Her thoughts were practical. Pull him out, drag him home, face the row. She took 2 steps, a third. Rosie lifted the box cutter, eyes fixed behind Nell's ankles. She reached out, closer. Then a hand came out of the dark and closed over Rosie's wrist, fast and clean, no wasted movement. Rosie's arm jerked slightly under the grip, but there was no struggle. The grip was too sure. The hold was placed exactly where it needed to be to stop motion without causing injury. Tiernan stepped into view as if he had been there for minutes, watching the whole thing unfold. He was close enough that Nell could see the rain on his coat and hat, could see the line of water running off the brim. He didn't look like a man who had just arrived panting from a run. He looked like a man who had chosen that spot and waited. His face held the same controlled stillness Nell remembered from the dance, from the hall, from the way he had moved through 3 lads like they were furniture. There was no drama on him, no wildness, just purpose. He didn't wrench Rosie's arm. He didn't hurt her. He simply held her wrist firm enough that the blade wasn't going anywhere, and he looked straight into her eyes. Rosie stared back at him, and that deep storm darkness tried to sit in her gaze again. Tiernan leaned close, his voice low enough that it was only for her. "Himmy, who he whispered, words like a small command pressed into the air. Then, quieter still, a line that sounded more personal than command, more like an order given to something that didn't like being ordered. "Lee, G." Rosie blinked. The darkness in her eyes thinned like cloud breaking. Her face changed, confusion flooding in behind the blank. Her eyebrows knit. Her mouth fell open slightly. Her gaze dropped, as if she had suddenly become aware of her own body again. She looked down at her own hand and saw the box cutter, and her mouth opened wider in a silent shock, as if she couldn't work out how it got there. Tiernan took it from her carefully. He slid the blade back in with a small click, folded it shut, and slipped it into his coat. His movements were precise, like he was putting away a tool after use. He didn't make a show of it for Nell. He didn't explain it. He simply removed it. Rosie's fingers flexed, empty now, as if her hand remembered weight that had been there. Nell stood rooted a few feet away, eyes wide and rain on her lashes.
"What?"
she started. Tiernan didn't let her words get out. He turned his gaze on Nell. His voice came out calm, controlled, annoyed in a way a man got when people stood too close to a fire. "Take her home," he said. "And don't forget the dog. He's tied up in a tree back there."
"What's going on?"
Nell asked. Tiernan's eyes flicked toward the sky. The storm was building with an edge to it, as if it had been waiting for night. The trees were beginning to sway harder. Rain came heavier, drops striking leaves and making a rattling sound like fingers tapping on glass. "This is one storm you don't want to be out in," Tiernan said. "Go, now." Nell's instincts finally caught up. She took Rosie by the arm, pulled her gently, and started back through the trees to fetch the dog. Her grip was firm. Rosie went without resisting, still half in fog, Nell steadying her without slowing. Rosie looked over her shoulder, small face drawn.
"Mr. Keane," she said, voice thin.
Tiernan didn't soften his face, but there was something steady in his eyes, something that told Rosie there was one instruction she had to follow if she wanted to keep herself. "Home," he told her, "and stay there." Then he turned away from them and walked toward the lake, alone. Nell kept going, dragging Rosie back through the brush and rain. She didn't look back again. She couldn't. She held her sister tight and pushed forward, because the sky was breaking and the woods felt suddenly full of corners. By the time Tiernan reached the shoreline, the storm had rolled fully in. Rain struck the reeds in sharp lines. It made the tall stalks bow and shake. The sound of it was constant and hard, like a curtain being torn down. The lake sat ahead, dark and wide, its face disturbed by drops, but holding a strange calm beneath the noise. Tiernan stopped at the edge and looked at it, coat already heavy with wet. The lake had a look of patience, as if it could outlast any weather. Lightning didn't crack, but the sky flashed with that muted, distant brightness, sheet-like behind cloud. The shoreline stones glistened. Water ran down in gaps between rocks and made small rivulets that raced back toward the lake, eager to return. Tiernan didn't charge in. He didn't throw himself at it like a man proving something. He just took stock, the way he always did. He looked left where the reeds thickened, where the mud held prints. He looked right, where the rocks rose sharper. He watched the waterline and saw it shifting in ways rain couldn't fully explain. The lake drew in and pushed out without rhythm, like a thing breathing under a sheet. His hand went to his coat. He drew out a thin, battered book wrapped in oilcloth. The oilcloth was dark and slick with rain, tied with simple cord. He untied it with quick fingers. He opened it with care. The pages were old and marked. The writing was Irish, dense and cramped, the kind of script the priests used when they were trying to keep a thing contained on paper. The ink had bled in places. Some lines were underlined. Some had small notes beside them in a different hand. The book looked like it had been used as a tool rather than read as comfort. Tiernan's voice dropped into his chest. Not a shout, nor a plea, a controlled murmur that sat under the storm. "Anish," he said, steady. "Fragger." The words didn't float up. They pressed down, as if it was pushing them into the air. He spoke a short line of Gaelic under his breath. The same few words repeated, not musical or petty, practical, like knocking on a door until someone answered. "Taramach," he said again. "Fragger dum." He didn't raise the volume. He didn't bargain. He repeated it like a man who refused to be ignored. The storm answered with another gust, reeds blowing, rain cutting sideways. The wind shoved at Tiernan's coat and tried to pull the book from his hand. He held it tighter, body angled against it. His boots shifted on slick stone and found firmer ground. Then the lake changed. The surface went still in a way rain couldn't explain. Drops landed and didn't spread properly. The water looked flat, like a sheet laid tight. A low keening began, not from the sky or from the trees, from the lake. It was subtle at first, like a thin wire vibrating, the sound threading itself under the storm. Then it strengthened, the pitch narrowing, becoming more focused, more present. It had the quality of a mouth forming one note and refusing to let it go. Tiernan lifted the book and began to speak from it, Irish words rolling out, as if he had learned them with his hands as much as his mind. It sounded like old prayer and old warning mixed together. The cadence was controlled. Each line was placed as if it mattered where it landed. He reached into his coat and took out tools, a fist of salt. The salt was damp already from the air. It clumped slightly in his palm. He cast it in one sweep along the edge of the water, enough to mark a boundary for himself. The grains hit the stone and mud and vanished quickly under rain, but the act mattered. The movement was deliberate, a line drawn in a language the lake might understand. He set an iron nail down on a flat stone and pressed his hand against it, grounding himself. The iron was cold. His palm felt it sharply, a clean sensation that reminded him he was in his body, in this place, on this shore. He kept reading, voice tight with focus. The lake shifted. It moved sideways, as if the whole body of water decided to lean. Tiernan's eyes went to the right, to the rocks. The pull drew toward them, jagged and slick with rain. Tiernan's boots slipped a fraction. He adjusted his stance, careful. He shifted his weight without fuss. The book stayed open. The words kept coming. The water held its stillness, then surged, not outward, but angled, like a shove with intent. It hit Tiernan hard. Tiernan went down into the rocks with a crack of shoulder and hip. Stone bit through his coat. A sharp pain flared along his shin. Bleeding. He made one sound, short and ugly, as the impact knocked the breath out of him. He tasted grit. Rain ran into his eyes and blurred everything for a beat. His legs scraped the rock and opened. Warm blood ran, thin at first, then heavier with the rain washing it. The lake wanted it. The water climbed his boot, cold and quick, gripping like a hand closing. It wasn't the ordinary creep of water over stone. No, this moved with purpose, climbing faster than it should. Tiernan tried to drag his leg back, but the water held him. It wrapped his wounded shin and tightened like a rope, like something alive. The keening rose, joined by another layer, a second voice, and then another, as if the sound had a depth to it that didn't belong to open air. It filled the space around Tiernan's head and pressed in, making the storm seem distant by comparison. Then the wailing began. It hit his skull in waves, the sound not just heard but felt, pushing at his thoughts. It was grief and hunger mixed together, a chorus of mouths that didn't care about meaning. It wanted only to overwhelm. Tiernan pushed himself up with one hand, book clutched in the other, trying to keep the words going. His fingers slipped on wet stone. He jammed his palm into a crack and hauled himself higher, stubborn, practical. The oilcloth wrapping flapped loosely and slapped his wrist. He spoke again, but his voice weakened, not from fear, from the drain that had begun. The water climbed his legs higher. It was drowning him. It was taking him. Tiernan's face went tight. His spine bent slightly as if the weight of years had landed on him all at once. The hair at his temples dulled. Lines deepened in his face, as if someone had drawn them with a dirty thumb. His hands, braced on stone, started to look older, veins rising, skin losing tone. It happened fast. Theft done with speed. The drain didn't stop to admire itself. It worked steadily. Tiernan's voice faltered on a line, then found it again. He forced the Irish words out like nails driven into wood. Each syllable felt heavier to form. His tongue felt thick. The book wavered in his grip as the muscles in his arms weakened. The storm roared above, and yet the lake's sound cut through it, and then shapes moved upon the water. Figures, pale in the dark, stepping across the surface as if it were hard ground. Dozens. An army of dead walking out, heads bowed, shoulders slumped, moving toward Tiernan as if answering the call of something older than weather. Their outlines were blurred by rain, but their movement was steady and inevitable. They didn't hurry because the lake had time. Behind them, something rose, a bulk in the water, swelling up from below, the shape of a man, and not a man, taller than any human should be, water pouring from it in sheets. The occultist from the records, pages plastered to him, the ruined paper swirling in the current around his body like a cloak. The pages slapped and turned as if the lake itself was reading them, and Tiernan's vision blurred. His hands shook with strain. He looked years older than he had been a minute ago, jaw set hard, eyes still sharp but fighting to stay open. He was losing. The water climbed higher and the drain deepened. taking strength and time together. His coat sagged on his shoulders. His fingers, when they tightened around the book, felt slow to obey. Tiernan's palm slipped on rock. He tried to lift the iron piece again. His hand didn't want to close. A figure stepped close on the surface, one of the dead, its feet making no mark on the water, its face blurred by the storm, but the hunger in its movements was clear enough. It leaned toward him as if drawn by the smell of blood. Tiernan's mouth formed another line, and it came out thin. It was close to the edge of what his body could hold, and then, through the wailing, a voice cut clean.
"On your feet, lad."
Tiernan turned his head, as if moving it was a task. Rain ran down his face, and for a second he couldn't see where the voice had come from. Over the hill, behind the shoreline, haloed by pale moonlight, breaking through the storm cloud, a shape came fast. Shamey, not running, not trotting, carried. The raven's wings beat with force that didn't match any bird Tiernan had seen. It drove the little man forward through the rain and wind as if the storm was nothing to it. The wing beats had a hard rhythm, purposeful, like it was throwing itself at the air to push it aside. Shamey clung on with one hand, hat jammed low, coat flapping wildly. In the other he gripped a hawthorn twig. His mouth split in a grin that was half pride and half filthy amusement, the only expression he knew how to wear when he was trying to hide seriousness.
"Your magic dust worked wonders for the hawthorn, lad,"
Shamey shouted, voice over the lake's scream. Then he hurled the twig down. Tiernan, aged and weakened, reached out with a hand that didn't feel like his own. He snatched it mid-fall. The hawthorn felt real in his grip, rough bark, sharp points, a sting against his palm. The sting was good. It reminded him of weight and texture and pain that belonged to the living world. Tiernan gathered what was left of him and drove it down in one hard movement, into the bed of the lake right beside him, where the shoreline dipped into dark mud and stone. He forced it deep, arm shaking with strain, hand pushing until the twig vanished beneath the surface. His shoulder screamed at him. His wrist protested. He ignored it. He pressed until there was no more to give. For a second, there was nothing, and then the wailing compressed into a single piercing shriek. The madman figure contorted, body twisting like a broken reflection in a cracked mirror. The pages around him tore loose and whipped in circles. The dead shapes on the water staggered as if a rope had been cut. The water spiraled inward. The lake didn't drain away like a bucket tipping. It folded in on itself. The surface dropped and tightened, pulled down into a point beneath the twig, as if the whole lake had been grabbed by the throat and forced to swallow itself. The feeding stopped instantly. Tiernan felt it like a hand releasing his bones. A ripple of force ran back up through him, not gentle or violent, a fast surge that travelled through his legs, through his spine, and into his hand gripping the wet rock. The years poured into him as quickly as they'd gone. Lines softened, his shoulders straightened, his hands steadied. Strength returned in a rush that made him sway, and the storm eased. Rain slowed from a lash to a steady fall. Cloud broke in the west, and a band of light slid under it, turning the wet reeds gold. The change in light was sudden enough to make the whole shore look different, as if the world had been wiped clean of its worst intention, just restored. Tiernan lay back in the rock for a moment, face turned to the sky, rain on his cheeks, not speaking. His breath came in steady draws, controlled, as if he refused to give the lake the satisfaction of hearing him struggle. And when he lifted himself again, the lake was altered. The surface was calmer. The wailing was gone, as if a mouth had finally been shut. The rain made ripples now, like proper rain, spreading normally without that unnatural flatness. Tiernan knelt at the edge and searched with his hands, feeling through mud and stone. His fingers sank into cold silt. He moved pebbles aside. He found weeds and pulled them up. He scraped at the bed where he'd driven the twig down. The hawthorn twig wasn't there. Above him, the raven circled and landed in a nearby tree, watching with those dark, intent eyes. Shamey dropped to the ground a little way off, shaking rain from his coat, grimacing like a man who had been carried in a way he didn't want to talk about. He walked up to Tiernan, hands on his hips, trying to look casual, as if he hadn't just come out of the sky like something from a mad tale. Tiernan looked at him and spoke first, voice low. "I thought I told you to go home." There was a sense of tease in it, faint, as if Tiernan couldn't help it. Shamey shrugged, as if it was a small thing.
"I went home."
Tiernan's eyes stayed on him. "And yet, here you are."
Well, I heard you were making a show of yourself."
Tiernan's mouth twitched, rain ran down his cheek, and he didn't wipe it. "You saved my life, Shamey," he said. Shamey waved a hand, dismissing it like an insult.
Don't be saying that now, or I'll start charging you for heroics."
Tiernan stood, wet and tired, but upright. He looked toward the tree where the raven sat. Shamey followed his gaze, and his face changed slightly, humour thinning. The grin didn't vanish fully, but it turned into something less certain. Neither of them spoke about that bird. Tiernan bent, picked up his book, and wrapped it again in the oilcloth. His fingers moved with care, even now, even with water running into the folds. He tied the cord, he tucked it into his coat. Then he turned from the lake and started back toward the village. Shamey fell into step beside him for a few yards, then hung back as if the shoreline demanded a little respect in retreat. The Concannon house was lit when Tiernan arrived. Lamps in the windows, a door half open as if Claire couldn't bear to shut the world out. The air around the house smelled wet and clean, rain cooling the stones, the earth breathing out after the storm. The yard had puddles now, small pools gathered in depressions. The ash tree over the gate dripped steadily, leaf tips letting go of water in patient drops. Claire met him on the step, eyes searching his face like a woman reading smoke for signs of fire. Her hair was damp at the edges, as if she'd stood in the doorway for too long already. Her apron was still on. Her hands were held together, tight at her wrist, fingers interlaced so hard the knuckles stood out. Behind her, Rosie stood in the kitchen, barefoot again but clean, hair brushed, posture normal, in a way that made her look like herself. Nell stood beside her, arms crossed tight, trying to be older than she was. Her shawl was damp, her cheeks were marked with rain streaks and the dirt of the woods. Her eyes were bright with the kind of shock that didn't know where to go yet. Mick was in the yard, hammering at fresh wood, building something low and solid, a swing frame, a man trying to put his hands to something that wasn't destruction. The hammer rose and fell with a steady rhythm. Each strike was placed like a penance. Tiernan didn't go deep into the house. He stayed in the doorway, hat in hand, rain still dripping from his coat. Water ran off the edge of his sleeve and fell in small drops to the threshold. "Is it done?" Claire said. "Aye, it's done," Tiernan said. The words didn't come with triumph. They came with fatigue and certainty. Claire's shoulders dropped slightly, like she'd been holding herself up with rage and fear alone. Her mouth opened, as if she might ask 100 questions, but only one mattered, and she couldn't form it properly. Tiernan kept it short. "Keep her from the water," he said. "Watch her sleep for a few nights. If she wanders, you wake her and keep her in her room. She'll be herself again soon enough." Claire stared at him, trying to decide if she could believe it. Her eyes flicked past him, down the lane towards where the lake sat out of sight. The fear had lived in that direction for days, and it didn't leave easily. Tiernan gave her no grand promise, just the straight line, and Rosie looked at him from behind her shoulder. Tiernan nodded once to her, nothing more, and Rosie's face was pale but calm. Her eyes looked like her eyes. There was no storm darkness in them now, only confusion and the aftertaste of a day she wouldn't fully remember. Nell stepped forward suddenly and wrapped her arms around him in a quick, fierce hug, the kind a teenager gives when she didn't know how to speak gratitude without feeling foolish. "Thank you," she said into his coat, voice muffled. Tiernan stood stiff for a second, caught off guard by the contact. Then he patted her shoulder once, awkward and controlled, a single gesture that said, "I heard you." Nell pulled back, eyes shiny, and went still. Mick looked up from his hammering. He didn't smile, he didn't try to talk. He lifted a hand in a respectful wave, a small surrender. His face looked tired, more tired than it had any right to be. The act of building something for Rosie, even in silence, had more than any apology he could manage. Tiernan gave him a nod and a small wave back, nothing dramatic. Then he turned and left. He didn't wait for thanks. He didn't wait for questions. He didn't step inside to feel the warmth. He walked back down the lane as if the work wasn't finished, because, in his mind, it wasn't. The road home was quiet. The storm had moved on, leaving the land rinsed and shining. The sky was still heavy in places, cloud bellies dragging low, but there were gaps now where light broke through, pale and clean. Tiernan rode lassie. Shamey sat on his small pony, grumbling under his breath about wet socks and the indignity of being hauled by a blasted bird. They travelled for a time without words, the kind of silence men shared after something heavy had passed through them. The hooves made a steady rhythm on the wet road. Water flicked up in small arcs from Lassier's steps. The pony's hooves landed with that stubborn sound as if it was offended by every puddle, and after a long stretch, Tiernan spoke, voice low and restrained. "Shamey?" Shamey didn't look over. "Aye?" Tiernan didn't dress it up. "You know, for a leprechaun, you're not the worst." Shamey made a sound that could have been a laugh or a cough.
You're welcome, boy. Don't make it a habit."
Tiernan's eyes stayed on the road. "You know, you didn't have to come back."
"That's the problem with you, Keane. You always think everything is about you."
Tiernan's mouth moved slightly. "Is it not?" Shamey spat to the side, rain catching it.
"This is my stop."
Tiernan glanced ahead. The road dipped toward a hill, hedges thick on either side. The landscape here felt older, quieter, as if even the stones had memories. Shamey pointed over the rise, casual.
"Father John's got a mouse infestation, so I hear. Might be an old bite in it for me."
Tiernan didn't bother answering to that. Shamey's pony slowed, and Shamey turned in the saddle and gave Tiernan a look, suggestive, sharp, almost playful. His eyes flicked toward the next hill, toward where the old hawthorn stood. He gave a small grin, as if passing a private joke. Then he said nothing more, turned off the road and disappeared over the hill, small shape swallowed by wet fields and shadow. Tiernan watched him go, brow faintly drawn, curiosity rising where it rarely rose, and he rode on. When Tiernan reached the place where the eldest hawthorn stood, he slowed. That old, ancient hawthorn rose out of the ground like it owned the county, dark branches spread against the last of the stormlight. Water clung to the thorns and made them glint. The trunk was slick and old, bark rigid, like a hand that had gripped the earth for centuries. Tiernan dismounted and crossed the uneven grass to where he'd re-sown the broken hawthorn piece earlier. He didn't know what to expect, a disturbance, the missing branch, whatever. He knelt and looked. The hawthorn he had sown was still there, growing untouched, not missing a piece. Tiernan's hand went to the spot in the soil where he had worked the vessel dust in. The earth was packed the way he had left it, clean edges still holding. The surface had been darkened by rain, but it hadn't been turned. No finger marks, no small footprints, no sign of meddling. He sat back on his heels, rain dripping from his cap brim. He looked down at his own hand. He remembered how that last ripple had run through him. He remembered the moment at the lake when the drain had stopped, when time had retreated from his skin and left him himself again. He remembered Shamey's hawthorn twig, how it had looked right and felt right and stung right. And then he looked down at the hawthorn clipping here, and the resemblance it made to the crabapple tree Shamey had pointed out to him a few days earlier. A tree where one clipping had been taken. The thought formed quietly, sharp as a needle. That twig Shamey had thrown down. Maybe it wasn't the source of the power. Maybe it was only the shape his mind needed. Tiernan stayed there for another moment, listening to the trees settle after the storm. The land was quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful. It felt like a pause between breaths. Then he stood, wiped his hands on his coat, and walked back towards his horse. Above him, in a nearby tree, a red-eyed raven perched, still as a nail in timber. It cawed once, twice, and then a whisper rode the wet air, so close it felt like it had come from the bird itself, and it said, "It's